Yo, SUC back in the building. Y'all know how we rocking, man. 7 gang, Source Gang over everything. Hey, man, it's a good one. We back with another one. We gonna go through this book, Return of the God Hypothesis. But before we get started, my brother LV didn't drop some new fire that I want to introduce to the world. You know what I'm saying? My brother LV Europa TV, subscribe to his channel, get hip to his sound and his music. Brother's a powerful artist, and he knows that he gets nothing but love over here at the Source Gang. Let's get it. So before we get into this book, you understand, and before we read the book, we are going to read the Fair Use Act, because this is copywritten material, and we will be adding commentary, reviewing it, and using Mr. Meyer's work, Dr. Meyer's work, for scholarship and research and education purposes. All right, so let's get into it. We're about to get started. 7 gang. All right, let's start this thing off right, man.
Major, baby.
Hey, Kim.
Wash the pain away, just to see who you are. Let me hear all the ladies say, yeah. And I couldn't talk to you, but you hit me with a fade away, If God brings sunshine, can you please take the red away? No rain, no more right now. Can you hit me with a shadow away? Pretty please, if you're hearing me, please, can you watch the pain away? Watch the pain away. Let it fade away. It hurts my soul to see the whole world broken. It hurts my eyes to see them young boys smoking. Mothers fighting daughters, daddy still hoping. Drugs turning free, every drop potent. Stayed up night on top of night so your eyes would be open. Half fight on top of fight so your life wouldn't be hopeless. Don't hang with the gangs, keep the knife where the rope is. I used to play the game, now the game made its coaches. Smoke till it was roaches, ate lunch around roaches. Heat the crib with the oven, but the love honey roasted. Mama hugged me at night to keep the spirit toasted. And I love her for every moment. Make way with what I go with. Break day to make your own shift. Don't take much to be the truth. When you own it, you know why. Wash your pain away. Just to see who you are. Let me hear what the ladies say. Yeah. And I couldn't talk to you, but you hit me with a fade away. If God brings sunshine, can he please take the red away? No rain, no more right now. Can you hit me with a shadow away? Pretty please, if you're hearing me, please, can you watch the pain away? Watch the pain away. Fade away.
Shout out to LV Europa TV. Show my brother some love, man. Subscribe to his YouTube channel. The brother, like I said, the brother's immensely talented. The brother's music is on point. And like I said before, we're going to continue to support my brother, man. All right, so before we get into today's hot topic, which is Return of the God Hypothesis by Dr. Stephen Meyer, I just want to address the Fair Use Act. So Section 107 of the Copyright Act provides the statutory framework for determining whether something is a fair use and identifies certain types of uses, such as criticism, commentary, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research, as examples of activities that may qualify as fair use. So we're going to be doing teaching, scholarship, research, and I will be adding commentary here and there and critiques as well. So we're well within our right to review this information and read this information on the channel. All right. So this is the book here. He announced this book a couple years ago, and I pre-ordered my copy. And the minute it released, I could download it on my phone, and I dug right into it. And the book is phenomenal. It came out at the end of March. As far as I got, this book is amazing. We're going to read all the way. We're going to read section 1, get all the way to chapter 3. We're going to read the preface. We're going to read why he wrote this book, the introduction, and all that good stuff. And this is going to be a journey until we complete this book. I admire Stephen Meyer's work. If you ever heard of his other book, you can see it on top of his new book, the New York Times best-selling author of Darwin's Doubt, which was a bombshell, which was amazing. It didn't read too well. You understand? You have to be an avid reader to actually read that book. I believe he made this book more digestible, if that makes sense, for the commoner and for the layman. You know, if you get my drift. So we're going to get into this book, and we're covered under the Fair Use Act because we will be doing this review, commentary, and reading of this book for scholarship and research purposes. All right, so with that being stated, let's open up his book and get started. You know how we rocking, man. We actually read books over here. We read books over here at the source. Like we pointed out before, a lot of brothers is faking the funk on YouTube. Mentioning books, don't read the books. Just, some guys are professional skimmers. Garfield, you're a professional skimmer. And you don't read the book in totality. You don't read even a chapter. You don't read, and you don't get the total context of what's being stated because you're a professional skimmer. We don't condone that over here at the source. And if you've been rocking with Yahshua, 7 Gang, Genesis 49ers, I don't condone that. We read over here. All right, so this is the beginning of the book cover by Dr. Stephen Meyer. Return of the God Hypothesis. 3 scientific discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. Let's get it. All right. And he has his dedication. He says, to my mother, Patricia Meyer, who first affirmed my philosophical interest, to my father, Charles Meyer, who challenged me to develop greater mathematical and scientific proficiency, to my wife, Elaine, whose willingness to step out on faith has made the whole adventure possible. All right. Contents. Now we're going to deal with the prologue. It says, it was a public speaker's nightmare unfolding at a most inauspicious time. 18 minutes into my opening statement in a debate with physicist Lawrence Krauss, America's most prominent scientific atheist, I suddenly found I could no longer read my own PowerPoint slides. The brightly colored swirls or auroras, for me, a telltale sign of the onset of debilitating migraine had begun to fill my visual field as I looked out through the blaze of lights behind the video cameras in a packed auditorium at the University of Toronto. Intense light had been a common migraine trigger for me, and it certainly was on that night in March 2016 as the auroras spread. I began having trouble seeing not only the quotations and scientific diagrams on my slides, but Professor Krauss himself in the audience as well. Other neurological symptoms, numbness in my fingers and tongue, my voice echoing in my own head, and a difficulty finding words, aphasia, followed, predictably in rapid succession. I was able to make it through the remaining 7 minutes of my presentation by speaking more slowly and deliberately than I usually do. In some cases, by using less technical words. But as I descended from the podium and was taken to a dark room, I felt both disoriented and disappointed. I realized it would now be difficult for me to say much in the ensuing roundtable following a third speaker about the main question of the forum, the one I specifically came to discuss. The organizers of the forum had chosen a topic: what's beyond it all? God, science, and the universe. Professor Cross, then of Arizona State University, and I were a logical match to discuss this question from opposing points of view. Indeed, he and I had debated twice before, and had often debated other scientific atheists during the preceding decade. Cross, who spoke first, had a reputation not only as an accomplished physicist, but also as a bold and outspoken controversialist, one with a talent for explaining scientific ideas to popular audiences. Give me a minute, bro. Let me go back, make sure everything's all right with the StreamYard. All right, we good. Shalom to the panel. Shalom to the family. All right, back to the reading. Controversialist, one with a talent for explaining scientific ideas to popular audiences. He is also well known for his provocative thesis that quantum physics can explain how the universe came into being from nothing. But that evening, he didn't begin with a defense of that position. Instead, he began by declaring the topic of the forum unworthy of reflection and by characterizing me as unworthy of engagement. And we all, this is my commentary, we all know what that is. When someone doesn't want to stand on their claims and then they want to make ad hominem attacks, they're either not confident in the topic or they feel that the person opposing their topic is a threat. So that's why they choose those tactics. And even Cross himself teaching something as absurd as the universe came from nothing. He backed down and used these tactics to attack Dr. Meyer. All right, reading on, it says, indeed, he began the debate, indulging in nearly 10 minutes of what his boisterous supporters clearly regarded as deliciously personal, effective, denouncing both me and, by extension, the organizers of the forum. If you appear on stage with someone talking about these ideas, it gives the impression that the ideas are worth debating or that the person is worth debating, Professor Cross declared. In this case, neither is true. So he disrespected the platform and he disrespected Dr. Meyer, which doesn't prove or substantiate his claim that the universe came from nothing. So, when you guys are watching debates online, when you're watching any material being discussed, and one of the proponents of the material or the opponent of the material is using these tactics, 9 times out of 10 is because they know they're standing on faulty ground. And they can't really defend their stance. So they try to do ad hominems, attack the platform, attack the person instead of the information. Let me read on. When a rival in debate descends to ad hominem argument, I usually find myself surprised at his willingness to waste allotted time. Audiences typically find insults masquerading as arguments unpersuasive. Moreover, in a debate, it usually takes a little to defang such tactics beyond pointing them out. That night, however, Cross's celebrity status had attracted hundreds of raucous supporters who laughed loudly at his punchlines, leaving me with the impression that an appeal to reason alone might not win the evening. As I began to speak, I pointed out that Cross had provided little evidence to support his critique of my views, and still less in support of his own. Ordinarily, I might have also made light of his use of the ad hominem tactic. But on that night, humor escaped me as my neurological distress grew progressively more acute while standing before a large audience in the auditorium and an estimated 60,000 people watching online. I had accepted the challenge of the debate in part to explain my own position about what science can tell us about the existence of God. This is, needless to say, an ultimate question and a question of urgent concern for many thoughtful people. It is an important topic, as even many atheists would agree, that deserves a serious response. And although I sought to offer one that night, after the migraine set in, I knew my ability to do so would be significantly limited. Though, as it turned out, the cloud of my diminished condition would come with a silver lining. For the debate, I had planned first to explain my core argument for the intelligent design of life, and then in the ensuing discussion to address a question I am often asked: who is the intelligent designer that you think is responsible for life? I also meant to address a closely related question: What does scientific evidence imply about the existence of God? Or, as the organizers of the forum put it, what lies beyond it all? Cross answers that question with an emphatic nothing, or at least nothing but the laws of physics. Though he denounces philosophy as a vacuous enterprise, he publicly advocates a philosophy that scholars call scientific materialism, an atheistic worldview affirmed by those who claim that science undermines belief in God. And I just want to make a quick note on that. Anyone pushing materialism, that is a philosophy. That is not built off empiricism or what we can observe. That's built off a philosophy that everything comes from matter and energy. We don't have any proof of that. It's just philosophy. That's all it is. It's not hard science. It's not empirical science at all. So back to the reading. It says, like other worldviews, scientific materialisms attempt to answer some basic questions about ultimate reality, questions about human nature, morality, and ethics, the basis of human knowledge, and even what happens to beings at death. Most fundamentally, scientific materialism offers an answer to the question, what is the entity or the process from which everything else came? Scientific materialists have traditionally answered that question by affirming that matter and energy and/or the laws of physics are the entities from which everything else came, and that those entities have existed from eternity past as the uncreated foundations of all that exists. Matter, energy, and physical laws are therefore viewed by materialists as self-existent. Similarly, materialists hold that matter and energy organize themselves by various strictly naturalistic processes to produce all the complex forms of life we see today. This means scientific materialists also deny that a creator or designing intelligence played any role in the origin of the universe or life, because materialists think that matter and energy are the foundational realities from which all else comes. They deny the existence of immaterial entities such as God, free will, the human soul, and even human mind conceived as an entity in some way distinct from the physiological process at the work in the brain. Real quick on that, they basically say the mind is a direct result of the brain, not a separate entity of the brain. I beg to differ. I am a dualist. I believe that the mind and the physical brain in our head work side by side in tandem. So let's keep reading. It says, materialism is a venerable worldview with a long history going back to ancient Greece. It has had many prominent intellectual proponents, including Democritus, Thomas Hobbes, Charles Darwin, Ernest Haeckel, Bertrand Russell, and Francis Crick. In recent years, powerful voices have popularized scientific materialism. Beginning about 2006, a group of scientists and philosophers known as the New Atheists ignited a worldwide publishing sensation. A series of best-selling books led by Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion, argue that science properly understood undermines belief in God. Other books by Victor Stenger, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Stephen Hawking, and Cross himself follow suit. In 2014, the Fox and National Geographic television networks aired in a revamped version of a famous 1980 series with physicist Carl Sagan, Cosmos, A Personal Voyage. The new series, Cosmos, A Space-Time Odyssey, hosted by astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, began by replaying the audio of Sagan's memorable materialistic creed from the original series. The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. The New Atheists and other science popularizers have explained the basis of their skepticism about the existence of God with admirable clarity. According to Dawkins and others, the evidence of design and living organisms long provided the best reasons to believe in the existence of God, because it appealed to publicly accessible scientific evidence. But since Dawkins insists, scientists have known that there is no evidence of actual design, only the illusion or appearance of design in life, according to Dawkins and many other neo-Darwinian biologists. The evolutionary mechanism of mutation and natural selection has the power to mimic a designing intelligence without itself being designed or guided in any way. And since random mutation and natural selection, what Dawkins calls the blind watchmaker, mechanism can explain away all appearances of design in life. It follows that belief in a designing intelligence at work in the history of life is completely unnecessary. Although Dawkins allows that it is still possible that a deity might exist, he insists there is absolutely no evidence for the existence of such being, rendering belief in God effectively delusional. Popular TV figure Bill Nye the Science Guy has echoed the perspective. In his book Undeniable Evolution and the Science of Creation, he says, perhaps there is intelligence in charge of the universe, but Darwin's theory shows no sign of it and has no need of it. Consequently, as Dawkins concluded in an earlier work, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Another new atheist philosopher, Daniel Dennett, gives an evolutionary account of the origin of religious belief in his book Breaking the Spell, one that ultimately attributes belief in God to a cognitive impulse programmed to us by the evolutionary process rather than a rational or evidentially based system of belief. Thus, for those who know this, Darwinism functions as a universal asset, eating away at any basis for religious belief in traditional religious-based morality. Other new atheists, including Lawrence Krauss, say that physics renders belief in God unnecessary. Krauss contends that the laws of quantum physics explain how the universe came into existence from literally nothing. Consequently, he argues it is completely unnecessary, even irrational, to invoke a creator to explain the origin of the universe. Stephen Hawking, formerly of the University of Cambridge and until his death in 2018, the world's best-known scientist, made a similar argument in his book The Grand Design, co-authored with Leonard Milanow. He argues that because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. While the universe exists, while we exist, thus for Hawking, it is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. The late Victor Stenger made similar arguments in his poignantly titled book, God, the Failed Hypothesis. All this high-profile science-based skepticism about God has percolated into the popular consciousness. Recent polling data indicate that in North America and Europe, the perceived message of science has played an outside role in the loss of belief in God. In one poll, more than 2/3 of self-described atheists and 1/3 of self-described agnostics affirm that the findings of science make the existence of God less probable. According to the same survey, the two most influential scientific ideas that have affected people's loss of faith are unguided chemical evolution of the origin of life and unguided biological evolution of the development of life. According to these surveys, these two ideas have led more people to reject faith in God than it has suffering from disease or death. Other polls have shown a dramatic rise in the group of pollsters calling the nones religiously unaffiliated, agnostic, or atheistic respondents among college and post-college young people in the 18 to 33 age range. The rapid growth of this group occurred precisely during the recent decade in which the new atheists have gained prominence. Indeed, there are many indications from personal interviews, public opinion polls, and website testimonials that college students in particular have been deeply influenced by the message of the new atheists. Many of these students now cite arguments similar to those made by Dawkins, Krauss, Dennett, and Hitchens as their main reasons for rejecting faith in God. These developments have particular poignancy and interest for me for two reasons, but both of which help to explain why I agreed to debate Krauss in 2016 and why I've chosen to write this book. First, I have long been interested in the question of biological origins. Over the last decade, I have written 2 books arguing that living systems exhibit evidence of intelligent design. whereas Richard Dawkins contends that living systems merely give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. I have argued that certain features of living systems, in particular, the digitally encoded information present in DNA and the complex circuitry and information processing systems at work in living cells, are best explained by the activity of an actual designing intelligence. Just as the inscriptions on the Rosetta Stone point to the activity of an ancient scribe, and the software in a computer program points to a programmer. I've argued that the digital code discovered within DNA molecules suggests the activity of a designing mind in the origin of life. Nevertheless, in making my case for intelligent design, I have been careful not to claim more than the biological evidence alone can justify. In my previous books, I did not attempt to identify the designing intelligence responsible for the origin of the information present in living organisms or to prove the existence of God. After all, though I don't hold this view, it is least logically possible that a pre-existing intelligent agent somewhere else within the cosmos, i.e., not God, might have designed life and seeded it here on Earth, as scientists who advocate a view known as panspermia have suggested. Instead, I have simply argued that the information present in DNA suggests the prior creative activity of an intelligent agent of some kind, as opposed to an exclusively blind or undirected natural process such as random mutation and natural selection. Despite this limited claim, my explanation for the appearance of design still places me at odds with the new atheists. Even so, though they and I have adopted diametrically opposed explanations for the appearance of design, we have focused our explanatory efforts on the exact same phenomenon of interest. And that leads to the second and perhaps more important reason for my interest in what I call the God hypothesis. The new atheists pose the question of what the evidence from the natural world as a whole shows about the existence or non-existence of God. My readers evidently share an interest in that question. Many, upon encountering my argument for the intelligent design of life, have written asking a series of questions of roughly the following form: if there is scientific evidence of the activity of a designing intelligence, then what kind of designing mind are we talking about? An intelligent agent within the cosmos or beyond? An immanent or a transcendent intelligence? A space alien or God? Since my previous two books led inevitably to such questions, it has increasingly seemed a natural next step for me to explore what science can tell us about them and about the possible existence of God. Slow to speak, the debate in Toronto and its aftermath sealed my decision to address this subject in a book-length treatment. In the debate, I was able to explain my basic case for intelligent design and biology. Nevertheless, my migraine, adult state made it difficult for me to say much about larger questions of what science could tell us about God, as I hope to do in an ensuing discussion. Nevertheless, one advantage of not being able to speak well or only being able to speak slowly and deliberately is that it forces you to say the most important things and to do so succinctly. I have a friend with Tourette syndrome who stutters and sometimes finds it difficult to work his way into fast-moving conversations. As a result, he often blurts out incredibly pithy insights that distill the essence of a topic in a few words, sometimes to the amazement of friends. Something similar happened for me that night. During the last 5 or 10 minutes of the debate, as my symptoms started to dissipate, but only just the moderator asked us to summarize our perspective on what science could tell us about what lies behind it all. I found myself briefly describing 3 key scientific discoveries that I thought jointly supported theistic belief, what I call the return of God hypothesis. Evidence from cosmology suggesting that the material universe had a beginning. Evidence from physics showing that from the beginning, the universe has been finely tuned to allow for the possibility of life. And 3, evidence from biology establishing that since the beginning, large amounts of new functional genetic information have arisen in our biosphere to make new forms of life, possibly implying, as I had argued before, the activity of a designing intelligence. After the debate, I received sympathetic mail from many people who felt badly about my having to battle a migraine at such a public event, but many who wrote also told me that the one thing they remembered about the substance of the debate was my closing statement and the succinct description of 3 scientific discoveries that together point not just to a designer, but to an intelligence with the attributes that religious deists have long ascribed to God. I realized later that I had, perhaps without planning to do so, distilled in a few words a way of structuring a persuasive and accessible science-based argument for the God hypothesis. Perhaps I thought it was time to develop this case. An unexpected discovery. Another unexpected benefit of participating in the debate occurred completely out of the view of the audience. As I prepared for the night and the 2 weeks leading up to it, I studied Cross's proposed explanation for the origin of the universe. I also pored over a key technical paper and book written by a Russian physicist, Alexander Vilenkin, whose ideas Cross had popularized in his book, A Universe from Nothing. I was stunned by what I found. Cross used the work of Vilenkin in effect to refute what is called the cosmological or first cause arguments for the existence of God, an argument that posits God as the cause of the beginning of the material universe. As I reflected on what Vilenkin wrote, however, I concluded that Cross completely missed the real import of Vilenkin's work, which arguably implied the need for a pre-existing mind. Let me stop here, because a lot of people do this in the conscious community as well. They will go to a book presupposing that this book or this information is actually killing the idea that's opposing theirs, or the God idea, or the Jewish idea, whatever ideology that we are supporting and claiming. Then we'll go back and read that source and read that book and be like, actually, this book is helping our cause. Actually, this book is giving us evidence for our foundation, our hypothesis, and our models. You understand? Shout out to Plumantis. Yeah, hit that like button, subscribe to the YouTube channel, support the source, man. Hitting that like button is free 99. It don't cost you a thing. All right, so let's get back into the reading. So he experienced that. He heard what Cross said about Vilenkin. He went and read the technical paper in the book, and he was like, okay, Cross, you missed the entire point. Vilenkin's work actually points to the need of a pre-existing mind. All right, let's keep reading. It says, over the preceding few years, I had noticed a similar pattern in the writings of other scientific materialists as they responded to arguments for intelligent design in both physics and biology. As I show in later chapters of this book, the allegedly strongest counter-arguments against the theory of intelligent design often inadvertently seem to strengthen rather than weaken the case for design. For example, attempts to explain the origins of what's called the fine-tuning of the universe by invoking a multiverse inevitably requires invoking prior unexplained fine-tuning. Attempts to explain the origin of the information necessary to produce new forms of life invariably either required prior unexplained information or involve simulations that required the intelligent guidance of a programmer, biochemist, or engineer as a condition of their success. Thus, common responses to the argument for intelligent design in physics and biology typically beg the question as to the origin of prior indicators of design and consequently strengthen those arguments. So let me add a commentary here, because that right there was just a gold mine of information. When people try to, argue for the multiverse, it's like, well, how do we explain how our universe is so orderly? How our universe has laws, and how our universe is not chaotic, where stars are slamming into each other. How is our universe able to create what we call Goldilocks zones, where it's not too hot and it's not too cold? The oceans are not frozen over, that we're able to have liquid water, and the earth to be creating an earth where it's habitable and we can live and breathe. How do you have that? How do you have all these things? And they say, well, there's a multiverse where the universes kept creating universes until it finally got it right. But then, okay, that begs the question, who fine-tuned those universes? Who created those universes? So it goes back to the need of an agent every time. Every argument, you still need an agent. You need some type of intelligent agent. It calls for agency. It calls for something to put things into order. That's the irony of these arguments. And that's what Dr. Meyer is pointing out very well in the opening of his book. Let's keep reading. It says, I now discovered that a similar problem attendant claims to have explained the origin of the universe from nothing. Properly interpreted, the physics used this way only seem to reinforce the conclusion of the cosmological argument. So my difficult evening in Toronto had another unexpected benefit. Going into it, I knew the typical and strongest counter arguments to each of the three interrelated arguments that I had long wanted to make in support of the God hypothesis. I already knew that two of those counter arguments inadvertently reinforce my case. Now, I came to suspect from my debate preparation and my interaction with Cross that the main counter argument to the third line of evidence I attended to marshal evidence from cosmology did the same thing. I realized it was time to write this book, and that was the reason his debate, his encounter with Cross in 2016 sparked his interest in writing this book, and we're going to dive into it. Let's go. Part 1, the rise and fall of theistic science. This part is very integral for our understanding, because when people mention science, we automatically think it's diametrically opposed or against religion, God, or a deity, or a theistic worldview. But if you actually know where science came from, or modern science came from, it came from a theistic worldview. A worldview that required a God, an all-knowing being. You understand? This goes into the column argument about if the universe exists, it needs a beginning, and if it has a beginning, it needs an agent. That comes from the Moors in the medieval times. So modern science arose from the theistic worldview, and that's what this part of the book explains, going from a theistic worldview to an atheistic worldview, and how science arose, modern science arose from monotheism. Let's get it. Part 1, the Judeo-Christian origins of modern science. I live and work in Seattle, where a few years ago, a prominent professor of evolutionary psychology, David Barash of the University of Washington, authored a startling New York Times opt. He told us of the talk he gives each year to his students, flatly informing them that science has rendered belief in God implausible. Or he explained, as evolutionary science has progressed, the available space for religious belief has narrowed. It has demolished two previously potent pillars of religious faith and undermined belief in an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God. Barash follows in a long tradition. Since the late 19th century, powerful voices in Western culture, philosophers, scientists, historians, artists, songwriters, and science popularizers have attested to the death of God. By this, they, of course, do not mean that God once existed and now has passed away, but instead that any credible basis for belief in such a being has long since evaporated. Those who tout the loss of a rational foundation for belief in God often cite the advance of modern science in the picture of reality it paints as the chief reason for the demise. The idea that science has buried God is pervasive in the media, in educational settings, and in our culture broadly. For example, Richard Dawkins has claimed that the scientific picture of the universe, and particularly evolutionary accounts of the origin and development of life on Earth, supports an atheistic or materialistic worldview. As he puts it, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Cross. This book shows that reports of God's decease have been grossly exaggerated. To appropriate a quote from Mark Twain, instead, the truth is just the opposite of what Dawkins, Barash, and numerous other popular spokespersons for science have insisted. The properties of the universe and of life, specifically as they pertain to understand their origins, are just what we should expect if a transcendent and purposive intelligence has acted in the history of life in the cosmos. Such an intelligence coincides with the human beings have called God. And so I call this story of the reversal, the return of the God hypothesis. Three big questions. My own interest in what scientific discoveries show about the possible existence of God germinated over 30 years ago when I attended an unusual conference. At the time, I was working as a geophysicist doing seismic digital signal processing from an oil company in Dallas, Texas. In February 1985, I learned of a Harvard historian of science and astrophysicist, Owen Gingerich, who was coming to town to talk about the unexpected convergence between modern cosmology and the biblical account of creation, as well as the theistic implications of the Big Bang Theory. I attended the talk on a Friday evening and found Gingerich had come to Dallas mainly to speak to a much larger conference the next day featuring leading theistic and atheistic scientists. They would be discussing three big questions at the intersection of science and philosophy: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin and nature of human consciousness. Fascinated, I attended the Saturday conference at the Dallas Hilton. The organizers had assembled a world-class lineup of scientists and philosophers presenting two great but divergent systems of thought. I was not surprised to hear outspoken atheists or scientific materialists explaining why they doubted the existence of God. What shocked me was the persuasive talks of leading scientists who thought that recent discoveries in their own fields had decidedly theistic implications. On the first panel, not only Professor Gingerich, but also the famed astronomer Alan Sandage of Caltech explained how advances in astronomy and cosmology established that the material universe had a definite beginning in time and space, suggesting a cause beyond the physical or material universe. Gingerich and Sandage also discussed discoveries in physics showing how the universe had been finely tuned from the beginning of time and its physical parameters and initial arrangements of matter to allow for the existence of complex life. This suggested to them some prior intelligence responsible for the fine tuning. Let me stop here real quick and add some commentary. So don't let anybody, with this being known about Gingerich and Alan Sandage from Caltech, this is proof that all scientists don't have that materialistic worldview that we are nothing but matter and energy. We don't have anything before that. We that's all we come from. There is no God. There is no theistic implication. That's BS. We are clearly seeing that scientists support theistic implications and a theistic origin of the universe. So when a lot of people say, well, if you're going against materialism or naturalism, then you're going against science. No, you're going against a worldview, which is a philosophy. You're not going against science. Science is a conceptual tool that we use to understand nature. It doesn't have a position. It doesn't have a worldview. It's a tool. So I have to make that noted, because a lot of people will use that as a defense mechanism to defend silly notions such as the universe coming from nothing. Oh, well, you're not dealing with science. No, you're dealing with philosophy, sir. All right, let's continue with the book. It says, neither wanted to claim that these discoveries prove the existence of God. They caution that science cannot prove anything with absolute certainty, but argue, however, that the discoveries seem to fit much better with a theistic perspective than a materialistic one. Professor Sandage caused a stir at the conference just by sitting down on the theistic side of the panel. It turns out that he had been a lifelong agnostic and scientific materialist and had only recently embraced faith in God. And he had done so in part because of scientific evidence, not in spite of it. So what turned Professor Sandage over to believe in a theistic origin of the universe? Scientific evidence did that. So don't let nobody tell you that you can't be a scientist and have a theistic worldview, or you can't be a scientist or deal with science and believe in God. That's false. That's a false dichotomy. That is not true. And as we're going to unveil in this chapter, later on in this chapter, modern science came from the mind of theists, people that believed in God. Let's keep going. It says the panel on the origin of the first life featured another similarly dramatic revelation. One of the leading origin of life researchers in attendance, biophysics Den Kenyon, announced that he had repudiated his own cutting-edge evolutionary theories of life's origin. Kenyon's theory, developed in a best-selling advanced textbook titled Biochemical Predestination, articulated what was then arguably the most plausible evolutionary account of how a living cell might have self-organized from simpler chemicals in a prebiotic soup. And here's a picture of the brother, Dan Kenyon, the biophysics. Now, he repudiated his earlier work. Watch this. But as Kenyon explained at the conference, he had come to doubt his own theory. Original life simulation experiments increasingly suggested that simple chemicals do not arrange themselves into complex information-bearing molecules, nor do they move in life-relevant directions, unless, that is, biochemists actively and intelligently guide the process. But if undirected chemical processes cannot account for the encoded information found in even simplest cells, might a directing intelligence have played a role in the origin of life? Kenyon announced that he now held that view. So Kenyon, a biochemist, was looking into the origin of life, and through experimentation, he proved that chemicals, random chemicals, cannot aggregate and create and encode DNA and make life. It's impossible. So through his experimentation, through practicing and using science, the conceptual tool, he went to the view of an intelligent designer. You wouldn't know this if you didn't read and study. You wouldn't know this if you just all you did was watch YouTube. So let's keep reading. It says, after the conference, I met one of Kenyon's colleagues and on the Origin of Life panel, a chemist named Charles Thaxton. Thaxton, like Kenyon, thought that information present in DNA pointed to the past activity of a designing intelligence to an intelligent cause, as he puts it. As I talked more to him over the ensuing days and months, I became more intrigued with the question of the origin of life and whether a scientific case could be made for intelligent design based on the discovery of the digitally encoded information in DNA. I decided to focus my own energies on assessing the possibility, eventually completing my PhD thesis at the University of Cambridge on the subject of origin of life biology. Much later in 2009, I published Signature in the Cell. In that book, I made a case for intelligent design based upon the information stored in DNA, though, again, without attempting to identify the designing intelligence responsible for life. Even so, through those years, I remained intrigued by the possibility that the evidence from cosmology and physics taken together with that of biology might provide the basis for a persuasive reformulation of a God hypothesis. To say that the God hypothesis has returned implies that scientists must have previously rejected it, and that at some still earlier time, a theistic perspective reigned, either as an inspiration for doing science, an explanation for specific scientific discoveries, or both. Yet few science popularizers today present the history of science and its relationship to religious belief this way. Instead, they not only assert that science and theistic belief currently conflict, but they also say that science and religion have nearly always been at war. They describe the historical relationship between science and religion as one characterized by conflicting claims about reality and competing ways of knowing. This chapter challenges the new atheist favored narrative about the historical relationship between science and theistic belief. It does so by showing how Judeo-Christian ideas contributed crucially to the rise of modern science. Let me read that again. It does so by showing how Judeo-Christian ideas contributed crucially to the rise of modern science. I bet you kids ain't learning that. I bet you your bottom dollar, your children are not learning that in public school, that science arose from the minds of theists. the minds of people that hold Judeo-Christian ideals. They're not telling you that. They're not teaching your children that. Let's keep reading. The history of science according to the New Atheists. The standard story advanced by New Atheists and more mainstream figures alike asserts that science and religious belief have generally stood in direct opposition. Consider, for example, the revised 13-part Cosmos series that aired in 2014. In the series, Neil deGrasse Tyson, a scientific materialist who dislikes the label atheist, attributes a loss of belief in God during the 17th century to the triumph of Newtonian physics. In the third episode, Tyson gives a detailed account of the collaboration between astronomer Edmund Halley and Isaac Newton. He recounts how this collaboration led to the publication of Newton's masterpiece, The Principia, in which Newton developed his mathematically precise theory of gravity. Tyson claims that the applicability of Newton's theory of gravity to the motions of the planetary bodies undermined the need for a master clockmaster to explain the precisions and the beauty of the solar system. Though Tyson acknowledged that Isaac Newton personally believed in God, calling him a God-loving man, he assured his viewers that Newton's religious beliefs did nothing to advance his scientific endeavors. Instead, he insisted that Newton's religious studies never led anywhere, and Newton's appeal to God represented the closing of a door. It didn't lead to other questions. Thus, according to Tyson, Newton's science liberated people from the belief in God, even as his belief in God impeded his own scientific progress. Tyson's message was clear. To do good science, scientists must throw off the shackles of religion, and the advance of science has allowed people in Western culture to do just that. Now, let me pause there for a minute. I'm a fan of Neil deGrasse Tyson. I like his podcast with the brother from New York. His name escapes me, but they have a podcast on YouTube. But this has to be one of the most contradicting statements he's made. And it's clear that he misrepresented Isaac Newton, saying it impeded. Actually, his belief in God, if anything, acted as a catalyst to his discoveries. But Stephen Meyer does a great job on unveiling that in this book. So we're going to keep reading. It says the warfare or conflict model. This perception of a perpetual and unavoidable conflict between science and faith arose relatively recently. During my first year of the study at Cambridge, Professor Colin Russell, then the president of the British Society for the History of Science and a distinguished professor in the history of science at another British university, the Open University, gave a well-attended talk about the so-called warfare thesis. Professor Russell explained that the perception of a deep inherent conflict between science and faith is a product of the late 19th century historical revisionism. Two such works help give rise to this understanding. They are John William Draper's History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, 1874, and Andrew Dixon White's A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, 1896. These books appeared in the immediate aftermath of the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of the Species in 1859. They fostered the impression that religious critics of Darwinism threatened to rekindle the Inquisition. As historian Edward Larson has put it, Draper regarded organized religion as a direct and existential threat to advancement of science. As he argued, Christianity and science are recognized by their respective adherents as being absolutely incompatible. They cannot exist together. One must yield to the other. Mankind must make its choice. It cannot have both. Another historian of science, Jeffrey B. Russell, observes that White's book was of immense importance because it explicitly declared that science and religion were at war. It fixed in the educated mind the idea that science stood for freedom and progress against the superstition and repression of religion. In his Pulitzer's Prize winning history of the Scopes trial, Summer for the Gods, Edward Larson notes that in the decades following the publication of The Origin of Species, this warfare model of science and religion became ingrained into the received wisdom of many secular Americans. In his talk at the Cambridge in his later writing, Colin Russell lamented how this model of relationship between science and religion became deeply embedded in the culture of the West and has proven extremely hard to dislodge. He has noted that the Draper-White thesis has been routinely employed in popular science writing by the media in a few older histories of science. Indeed, So the new atheists claim to advance the new perspective. Their view of the relationship between science and faith merely echoes this late 19th century historiography. Now, real quick commentary. It said revisionism because this came later. Modern science arose between the 16th and 17th century. And then the new atheists tried to revise the history to try to blot out when it actually arose and the theistic implications when it arose, right? So let's keep reading. It says a different understanding. In truth, a chorus of 20th and 21st century historians, philosophers, and sociologists of science tell a significantly different story. These scholars include Herbert Butterfield, A.C. Crombie, Michael B. Foster, Lauren Isley, David Lindbergh, Owen Gingerich, Roger Hukas, Robert Merton, and Pierre Duhem, Colin Russell, Alfred North Whitehead, Peter Hodgins, Ian Barber, Christopher Kaiser, Holmes Roaston III, Steve Fuller, Peter Harrison, and Rodney Stark, to name a handful. Although some scientific theories during the 19th century, particularly those concerning biological origins and geological history, did seem to challenge some traditional theistic ideas, these historians note that the belief in a God in Christianity specifically played a decisive role in the rise of modern science during the 16th and 17th centuries. Certainly when Draper and White were writing, many scientists perceived a conflict between science and religious belief, but this was not always the case. Instead, almost all historians of science today offer a more nuanced view. They maintain that although some scientists or scientific theories challenge belief in God, in some periods of scientific histories and other religious beliefs actually inspired scientific advance. In addition, many historians of science have shown that belief in God served both as an inspiration for doing science and as a framework for explaining scientific observations during the crucial period known as the Scientific Revolution, roughly between 1500 and 1750, in which modern science as a systematic endeavor first originated. So that was a bomb, and that paragraph was a bomb because again, you're not going to hear that in no school. Your children are not going to learn that. That God, that theistic worldview was the driving force for modern science. And that's how modern science arose. We the source here. We deal with the source material. Let's get back into it. So modern science as a systematic endeavor first originated from this theistic worldview. And God was the driving force behind it. The belief in God was. Let's keep going. The rise of theistic science. When I was a college professor, I used to team teach a large core Western civilization class on the history of science and technology. When I lectured about the scientific revolution, my students were always surprised to learn that so many historians and philosophers of science now identify Judeo-Christian ideas as crucial to the origin of modern science. I first encountered this thesis myself during my first year of graduate school. That the thesis seemed as uncontentious among my Cambridge tutors also surprised me, giving the atheistic or agnostic proclivities of most of the faculty in the departments of the history and philosophy of science. Philosophy of science, where I was a student. One incident particularly confirmed my perception of the religious orientation of most of the faculty. After seminars, the faculty would often retire to a local pub for further discussions with students. On one occasion, a fellow graduate student from the United States, evidently feeling as insecure in these new surroundings as I was, decided to reveal proudly that he had rejected his former religious beliefs and now considered himself an atheist. This attempt to curry favor with the faculty members met with an unexpectedly dismissive response. One of the younger, hipper British lecturers in our department replied by saying, "Well, of course you're an atheist, but what else are you that makes you interesting?" I resolved at the point not to make a show of my own metaphysical opinions, as I doubted that they would have been even as well received as those of my classmates. Despite such pervasive leanings, many of the historians, sociologists, and philosophers of science I encountered and read recognized the important role that belief in God had played in the scientific revolution. They did so in part because it has helped answer what might be called why there, why then question. The X factor, a transposition of thinking. The Cambridge University chemist and historian of science Joseph Needham first posed the why there, why then question in his research on scientific revolution. Needham observed that the material necessities for conducting science existed in many well-developed cultures. The Egyptians erected great pyramids, palaces, and funerary monuments. The Chinese invented the compass, block printing, and gunpowder. The Romans built great roads, aqueducts, and the Greeks had great philosophers and some whom study nature extensively. Yet none of these cultures developed the systematic methods for investigating nature that arose in Western Europe between about 1500 and 1750. Sophisticated material cultures, the late Oxford physicist and historian of science Peter E. Hodges made a similar observation. Many civilizations had a sophisticated material cultures, or what Hodges called the material requirements for the growth of science, as Hodges explained. If we think about what is needed for viable birth of science, we see first of all that it needs fairly well-developed society so that some of its members can spend most of their time just thinking about the world without the constant preoccupation of finding the next meal. It needs some simple technology so that the apparatus required for experiments can be constructed. There must be also a system of writing so that the results can be recorded and sent to other scientists, and a mathematical notation for the numerical results of measurements. These may be called the material necessities of science. Since many cultures had these necessities, Needham and Hodges wondered why modern science arose so dramatically in Europe during a fairly narrow window of time, and why these other cultures did not develop anything like Western science with its formal methods of study of the nature. Why did human beings begin to unlock nature's secrets in such a revolutionary, systematic way in Western Europe during the 16th, 17th centuries? Needham, Hodges, and many other historians, such as Herbert Butterfield and Ian Barber, identify the missing X factor in the realm of ideas. They point to Judeo-Christian ideas prevalent in Europe before the 16th and 17th centuries. Barber argues that science in its modern form arose in Western civilization alone among all the cultures of the world because only the Christian West had necessary intellectual presuppositions underlying the rise of science. As Butterfield, former professor of modern history at the University of Cambridge, explained, it was supremely difficult to escape from the previous Aristotelian doctrine by merely observing things more closely. It required a different kind of thinking cap, a transposition in the mind of the scientist himself. A break with Greek thought. These historians found the reaffirmation of the Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation during the Catholic late Middle Ages and Protestant Reformation provided the needed transposition. That was the changes that led to the break with the Greek thinking that had previously limited the advances of science. The needs for such break puzzled me when I first learned of it. The Greeks are heroes in the Western intellectual tradition. Their rationalist credo, the world is orderly, knowable, and best known by human reason, as physicist Los Caillefer has formulated it, made them the great paragons of reason in the ancient world. Nevertheless, many Greeks' assumptions tended to impede the development of rigorously empirical and observational approach to nature. Though Greek, Jewish, and Christian philosophers all agreed about the rationality of nature, some Greek ideas induced a sterile armchair philosophizing unconstrained by actual observations. Although Greek philosophers thought that nature reflected the underlying order, they nevertheless believed that this order issued from an intrinsic self-existent logical principle called the logos, rather than from a mind or divine being with a will. For this reason, many Greek thinkers assumed that they could deduce how nature ought to behave from first principles based upon only superficial observations of natural phenomena, or without the actual observing of nature at all. In astronomy, for example, Aristotle, 4th century BCE, and Ptolemy, 2nd century CE, both assumed that planets must move in circular orbits. Why? Because according to Greek cosmology, The planets moved in a quintessential rim of crystalline spheres, a heavenly rim in which only perfection was possible. Since they deduced the most perfect form of motion was circular, the planets must move in circular orbits. What could be more logical? As a historian science writer Hukias explained, when medieval Aristotelians said things happen according to nature, this meant that they followed a pattern and seemed rational to the human mind, one which had been discovered by Aristotle. The overestimation of pure reason and reliance upon logical necessity manifested itself in other ways. After the rediscovery of Aristotle's work in the West in the 11th century, Christian theologians were eager to synthesize their theological beliefs with the best classical learning. They often adopted Greek assumptions about what nature must look like, invoking consideration of logical necessity and often Aristotle's authority. Some medieval theologians and philosophers asserted that the universe must be eternal, that God could not create new species, that God could not have made more than one planetary system, that God could not make an empty space, that God could not give planets non-circular orbits, and many other such propositions. So we can clearly see before we read on how the Aristotelian method really stymied the advancements of science, because we know all of those last statements are not true. So let's keep reading. It says, contingency of nature. For science to advance, natural philosophers, or scientists as we refer to them today, needed to develop a more empirical evidence-based approach. This began to occur well before the scientific revolution because of a shift of thinking about the source of the order in the physical world. In 1277, Anthony Tempier, the Bishop of Paris, writing with the support of Pope John the 21st, condemned Necessarian theology. And 219 separate theses influenced by Greek philosophy about what God could or couldn't do. Before the decree of 1277, Christian theologians and philosophers, particularly at the influential University of Paris, often assumed that nature must conform to seemingly obvious logical principles as exemplified by Aristotle's cosmological, physical, or biological theories. The Judeo-Christian, indeed biblical doctrine of creation helped liberate Western science from such necessitarian thinking by asserting the contingency of nature upon the will of a rational God. Like the Greek philosophers, the early modern scientists thought that nature exhibited underlying order. Nevertheless, they thought this natural order had been impressed on nature by a designing mind with a will. The mind and the will of a Judeo-Christian God. For this reason, they thought that the order in nature was the product not of logical necessity, but of rational deliberation and choice, what the Scottish theologian Thomas Torrance calls contingent rationality. Let me stop there. That's why when we get to the Newton part, he'll say, well, if the universe has laws, there must be a lawgiver. This is how they were observing empirical science. This is how they came up with the methodology. And the names even point to a theistic or theist point of view. Mechanisms, that word that we use in the field of science. All of these names imply some intelligent source for creation. Let me keep reading. It says, by reaffirming the doctrine of creation and the sovereignty and freedom of God to create as God saw fit, Tempier's decree in 1277 emphasized this principle. This transposition in thinking led to a different approach to the study of nature in the centuries and following Tempier's decree. Just as there are many ways to paint a picture or design a clock or organize the books in a library, there are many ways to design and organize a universe. Because it had been chosen by a rational mind, the order in nature could have been otherwise. Thus, the natural philosophers could not merely deduce the order of nature from logical first principles. They needed to observe nature carefully and systematically. As Robert Boyle, one of the most important figures of the scientific revolution and founder of modern chemistry, explained, the job of a natural philosopher was not to ask what God must have done, but what God actually did. Boyle argued, and we all know about Boyle's law on gas, right? He is a pillar in the scientific community. This is what he argued. Listen, Boyle argued that God's freedom required an empirical and observational approach, not just a deductive one. Scientists needed to look and to find out. As historians of science, I.M. Berber explains, the doctrine of creation implies that the details of nature can be known only by observing them. Let me stop here. That's empirical science. That's empirical science. It came from theists. The idea of studying nature, looking for empirical systematic methods to explain nature, came from the mind of theists. They're not going to teach your children this in science class in biology and chemistry. When they learn about Boyle's law, they're not going to learn his reasoning and what drove him. Let's keep reading. The intelligibility of nature. Moreover, since nature had been designed by the same rational mind who had designed the human mind, the early modern scientists, or again, natural philosophers, who began to investigate nature also assumed nature was intelligible. It could be understood by the human intellect. The founders of modern science assumed that if they studied nature carefully, it would reveal its secrets. Their confidence in the assumption was grounded in both the Greek and the Judeo-Christian idea that the universe is an orderly system, a cosmos, not a chaos. As the British philosopher Alfred North Whitehead argued, there can be no living science unless there is a widespread of instinctive conviction of the existence of an order of things, and in particular of an order of nature. Whitehead particularly attributed this conviction among the founders of modern science to the medieval insistence upon the rationality of God. Other scholars have amplified this observation. They insist that modern science was specifically inspired by the conviction that the universe is the product of a rational mind who designed the universe to be understood, who also designed the human mind to understand it. A historian and philosopher of science, Steve Fuller, notes, Western science is grounded in the belief that the natural order is the product of a single intelligence from which our own intelligence descends. Philosopher Holmes Rosen III puts the point this way. It was monotheism that launched the coming of physical science, for it premised an intelligible world, sacred but disenchanted, a world with a blueprint, which was therefore open to searches of the scientists. The great pioneers in physics, Newton, Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, devoutly believed themselves called to find evidence of God in the physical world. The astronomer Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630, for example, explained that God wanted us to recognize natural laws and that God made this possible by creating us after his own image that he could share in his own thoughts. Powerful information. Like, why is this not being taught? Why is this not being brought up? This whole book is a bomb. Let's go. Let's get back to it. Stephen Meyer is a beast. Stephen Meyer is a beast, man. We appreciate his work. All right, let's keep going. Thus, the assumption that a rational mind with a will had created a universe gave rise to two ideas, contingency and intelligibility, which in turn provided a powerful impetus to study nature with confidence that such study would yield understanding. The fallibility of human reasoning. Another biblical idea influenced the development of an observational and experimental approach. Even as scientists during the 16th and 17th century saw human reason as a gift of a rational God, these same scientists, many influenced by the Protestant Reformation and ideas from the church fathers recovered during the late Middle Ages, also recognized the fallibility of humans and therefore the fallibility of human ideas about nature, as Steve Fuller explains. Research in history and philosophy of science suggests two biblical ideas as having been crucial to the rise of science. both of which can be attributed to the reading of Genesis provided by Augustine, an early church father whose work became increasingly studied in the late Middle Ages and especially the Reformation. Augustine captured two ideas in the Latin coinage, which prima facie cut against each other, imago Dei and peccatium originis. The former says that humans are unique as species and are having been created in the image and likeness of God, while the latter says all humans are born having inherited the legacy of Adam's era, original sin. Fuller goes on to argue that once Christians began to read the Bible for themselves, as they did with the availability of printed books from the 15th century on, they too picked out those ideas as salient in how they define the relationship to God. This biblical understanding of human nature extended to how they did science. Such a nuanced view of humans' nature implied, on the one hand, that human beings could obtain insight into workings of the natural world, but that on the other, they were vulnerable of self-deception, flights of fancy, and prematurely jumping to conclusions. This composite view of reason, one that affirmed both its capability and fallibility, inspired confidence that the designs and order of nature could be understood if scientists carefully studied the natural world, but also engendered caution about trusting human intuition, conjectures, and hypotheses unless they were carefully tested by experiment and observation. So that comes from the Judeo-Christian theists. Experimentation and observation. We already know how hypotheses are formulated through that method, the scientific method. This way of thinking, this mode of thinking came from Judeo-Christians, from theists. Did not come from atheists. It's going to be a long night. Let's keep reading. Moreover, as the Australian historian of science, Peter Harrison, has noted, a renewed emphasis during the Protestant Reformation on the doctrine of the fall of humankind, as well as the fallen state of nature, meant that scientists should not take their initial observations of nature at face value. Instead, they must interrogate nature using systematic experimental methods. This view of human reason has influenced science down to the present day. The methods for checking hypotheses developed by such figures as Francis Bacon during the 17th century and William Whewell during the 19th century assumed both the capability and fallibility of human reason. As Fuller notes, this sensibility carried into the modern secular age, as perhaps the best illustrated in our own day by Karl Popper's method of conjectures and refutations. The stronger, the better in both cases. We should aspire to understand all nature by proposing bold hypotheses, something of which we are capable because of the imago Dei, but to expect and admit error, something of which we are inclined because of the peccatium originis, whenever we fall short in light of evidence. In fact, one finds evidence of this concern to check human insight and intuition against empirical evidence going back further into the Middle Ages, as early as the 13th century. The Oxford theologian and philosopher Robert Grotest, along with his famed student Roger Bacon, developed the scientific methods of inference, such a method of resolution and composition, as methods of testing causal hypotheses such as verification and falsification. The later closely resembled the modern scientific method of isolation of variables. These methods reflected both an early interest in systematic study of natural phenomena and a recognition of limits of human reason unaided by observation of the world. Scientists today use both these methods of hypothesis testing. Accordingly, the distinguished Oxford University historian of science, Alistair Crombie, calls Grotest the real founder of tradition of scientific thought in medieval Oxford, in some ways of the modern English intellectual tradition. Grotest was also one of those theologians who helped to recover and reemphasize the doctrine of creation during the late medieval period. He lectured on numerous biblical books and especially on the book of Genesis. Now let's move on to Occam's razor. Another 13th century theologian who contributed to the development of a scientific method was William of Occam. He is best known today for his famed razor, the methodological principle that encourages scientists to avoid multiplying unnecessary explanatory entities, and in that sense, to favor simpler hypotheses. William Ockham also emphasized the contingency of creation and its dependence on the will of God, its creator. Occam's razor, in his famed dictum, never posit pluralities without necessity, helped to liberate science from the appealing to what scholastic philosophers call Aristotelian substantial forms. According to Aristotle, all objects resemble four different types of causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. The material cause of an object is a material substance or stuff out which the object is made. In the case of a chair, the wood, the formal cause represents either the form the entity exemplifies, for example, the shape of the chair, or the idea that produced the form, the blueprint in the mind of the designer of the chair. The efficient cause of constitutes that mean by which the object was made, the manufacturing process that produced the chair. And the final cause represents the purpose for which the entity was made, in the case of the chair, providing a place to sit. Though this schema applied nicely to analyzing individual objects made by human agents, it did not apply so readily to understanding regularities or cause and effect patterns observed in nature. Instead, attempts to describe such repeatable phenomena by a reference to formal and final causes often resulted in laughable, vacuous, or circular kinds of explanations, especially in physics and chemistry. Thus, when scholastics observed that bread always nourishes, or that a certain medicine ameliorates a condition, or the opium repeatedly puts people to sleep, they would invoke an abstract formal cause or virtue to explain the phenomenon. This practice often devolved into merely attributing causal powers to the name of the effect in question. For example, medieval scholastics would explain the ability of bread to nourish by citing its nutritive value, the ability of medicine to relieve discomfort by citing its curative virtue, of the ability of opium to induce sleep by references to the dormitive virtue. Occam regarded the existence of such virtues or formal causes, as well as the universals such as Platonic forms, with skepticism. He suggested they represented merely names or concepts in the human mind, not actual entities in reality. He employed his razor to eliminate appeals to such explanatory entities, opening the door to simpler or at least more illuminating explanations. Occam's skepticism about the existence of scholastic substantial forms also reflected his belief in the fallibility of human reasoning and the vanity of human imagination. Both, he thought, needed to be checked by observation and by the application of sound methodological principles, such as his principle of parsimony, i.e., his razor. This thinking sprang from deep-seated theological convictions. Occam's principle of parsimony came from his conviction in the underlying God-given order and elegance of natural phenomena. His emphasis on the need to check hypothesis against experience reflected his theological voluntarism. The understanding that natural world owes its orderly concourse to the free choice of an intelligent creator who could have made nature otherwise. Thus, in his old formulation of the principle of parsimony, he expressed both the importance of experience as well as reason in his foundational theological convictions. As he put it, for nothing ought to be posited without a reason given, unless it is self-evident or known by experience or approved by the authority of sacred scripture. That's an actual quote from Occam. Assessing the warfare model. I started my postgraduate work in the history and philosophy of science well before new atheists came on the scene. In 1986, my first year at Cambridge, Richard Dawkins had only just published The Blind Watchmaker, his popular treatise explaining how contemporary neo-Darwinian theory can explain the appearance of design in biological systems without invoking an actual designing intelligence. Later, in the books such as River Out of Eden, 1995, and The God Delusion, 2006, Dawkins built on the argument to suggest that the absence of evidence for a designing intelligence in the history of the life rendered by the God hypothesis unnecessary and even delusional. These books argue that atheism or scientific materialism provided a better overall metaphysical explanation for the picture of the world revealed by science for two reasons. First, Dawkins claims, as I noted earlier, that the universe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, only blind, pitiless indifference. Second, since in his view neither life nor the universe revealed any evidence of actual as opposed to apparent design, atheism or materialism provided a more parsimonious explanation of the world. If there was no evidence of an actual design in the universe and thus no evidence of design by God, why continue to believe in such a being? In the late 1980s, aggressive atheistic polemics in historiography had not yet become a staple of our culture. Nevertheless, the idea that science and religion had long been at war had already deeply permeated scholarly thinking as well as popular culture and assumptions of many in the media. Consequently, during my first few months at Cambridge, as I was reading many historians of science who doubted the warfare model, I still wondered if they were revisionists. Perhaps the contemporary historians had gotten it wrong. Maybe Draper and White, the popular spokesperson of science, such as then popular Carl Sagan, were right after all. I decided to dig into the question of the historical relationship between science and theistic belief in more depth by reading the works of the founders of modern science for myself. All right, we're going to read chapter 2 and chapter 3, and that's going to conclude section 1. And, Lord will, I'll be back tomorrow to go into section 2. Let's keep reading. It says, 3 metaphors in the making of the scientific world picture. During my first year of the postgraduate study in the history and philosophy of science, I encountered the works of numerous historians of science who argued that Judeo-Christian assumptions had influenced the rise of modern science. My program at Cambridge required students to write several long essays under the supervision of tutors before beginning work on a longer master thesis, which, if approved, could lead to acceptance into the PhD program. I chose 3 topics exploring the ideological origins of modern science more deeply. My research covered books by historians of science about the ideological influence on the early modern scientists, but also the primary sources, the writings of early modern scientists themselves. In this process, I repeatedly encountered 3 metaphorical ways of describing nature and nature's relationship with God. Time and time again, scientists writing during the scientific revolution and philosophers and theologians writing in the centuries leading up to it likened nature to a book, a clock, a law-governed realm. Later, when I was teaching, I highlighted these 3 metaphors to show that the importance of Judeo-Christian conceptions of God and nature to the rise of modern science. I described what scientists during the scientific revolution meant by these 3 figures of speech, why each reflected a Judeo-Christian worldview, and how each in turn inspired a guided scientific investigation. Early in Christian era, theologians began referring to nature as a book, one that they likened to the Bible in its ability to reveal the attributes of God. Just as the book of Scripture told of God's character and plans, so too did the book of nature reveal God's power and wisdom. As early as the 3rd century, the Christian monastic Anthony the Abbot referred to the created nature as a book, one always at his disposal whenever he wanted to read God's word. Another early church father, Basil the Great, similarly argued, we were made in the image and likeness of our Creator, endowed with intellect and reason, so that our own nature was complete and we could know God. In this way, continuously contemplating the beauty of creatures through them as if they were letters and words, we could read God's wisdom and providence over all things. Other influential Christian theologians, including Augustine, Maximus, and Confessor, and later Thomas Aquinas, routinely employed the metaphor of 2 books. Moreover, scriptural texts such as Psalm 19 in the Old Testament and Romans 1 in the New Testament seem to support this common usage. Psalm 19 affirms the heavens declare the glory of God, and even that days after days they pour forth speech. In Romans 1, St. Paul argues, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature, sometimes translated wisdom, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. With the reaffirmation of the doctrine of creation during the late Middle Age and Reformations, these passages about the revelatory nature of the created order took on new significance. The founders of modern scientific disciplines would cite them as inspirations for the systematic study of nature. John Ray, a leading 17th century biologist, published a massive 2-volume study, The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation. His title clearly referring to the passages from Romans just cited. Robert Boyle not only referring to nature as books, but went so far as to argue the study of the books of nature is one of the ends of the institutions of the Sabbath. In other words, God has established the Sabbath in part to create time and leisure for scientific consideration of God's works creation. Real quick sidebar on that. I believe the book of Sirach or somewhere in the Apocrypha says wisdom is gained in leisure. Wisdom is gained in leisure. And we read a quotation earlier about when a society doesn't have to, basically, if a society's not hunter-gathering, they're able to develop science because they're not always worried about with the preoccupation of the next meal. So, that's also talking about wisdom coming in leisure when you're not constantly moving or working or, trying to hunt and trying to survive. Let's keep reading. It says, he also explained in an essay titled of the study of the book of nature that his Sabbatarian convictions nevertheless allowed for the study of nature as an act of worship even on Sunday. As he put it, I scruple not when opportunity invites to spend some studying of the books of the creatures, either by instructing myself in the theory of nature or trying those experiments that may improve my acquaintance with her. Viewing the natural world as a book that reveals the character and nature of God provided a theological inspiration for the formal study of the natural world. It also reinforced conviction in the intelligibility of nature because it implied that the divine author not only speaks through the book of nature, but that men and women made his image and endowed with his rationality were equipped to read and understand it. The metaphor of the book of nature also implied the legitimacy of scientific endeavor, since it affirmed that nature supplied the secondary source of authoritative revelation about the character and wisdom of the Creator. This suggested that scientists could study nature and learn its secrets without needing to consult with theologians about whether their findings passed through the theological muster. Nevertheless, since nature and scripture issued from the same source, namely God, the early modern scientists assumed that both sources of revelation would ultimately align in either convergent or complementary testimony. Thus, Boyle, for example, never considered the possibility that the study of nature would undermine belief in God, but instead regarded devotion to the study of nature like the devotion to the study of scripture as an act of piety, especially since he thought God desired to have his works regarded and taken notice of. The clockwork nature. Leading natural philosophers during the scientific revolution commonly employed another metaphor. They often referred to the nature as a clock, or more generally, as a machine. This metaphor also associated with Robert Boyle, as well as Nicole Oresme, a 14th century philosopher and scientist at the University of Paris, implied both the contingency and intelligibility of nature, and implied the contingency of nature since good craftsmen can make many different kinds of clockworks to accomplish the same end. It implied the intelligibility of nature because, like the clocks in the great medieval towers, the clockworks of nature were designed by a rational agent, thus making discernible the mechanisms upon which the orderly concourse of nature depends. As Boyle described nature, 'tis like a rare clock, such as may be at Strasbourg, where all things are so skillfully contrived that the engine began once set at moving, all things proceed according to the artificer's design. The metaphor exercised considerable influence on how natural philosophers thought about their task. Many, including Boyle, refer to themselves as mechanical philosophers, and in so doing, explicitly broke with the Aristotelian scholastic practice of explaining natural phenomena by reference to insensible and, in Boyle's view, unintelligible substantial forms or formal causes of virtues. Boyle and other mechanical philosophers rejected naming game, describing the previous chapter, and instead insisted on looking for specific physical mechanisms, material interaction between corpuscles of matter or material structures as explanations for the regularities of nature. Boyle himself did this in his work studying the properties of air, positing various mechanisms of interaction between the corpuscles of air to account for the spring-like behavior under compression. The term corpuscles referred to small particles thought to be the most fundamental constituents of light or a material substance. With his famous gas law, he also described the relation between pressure, volume, and temperature of air. In addition to rejecting appeals to substantial forms, Boyle discouraged appeals to direct and singular activity of God to explain natural regularities. He did so because he thought such appeals subverted the attempt to understand the God-given causal powers of natural entities, and thus the true, if proximate, causal explanations for the regularities of nature. The same passage in which he likened God to the artificer of a great clock also explained that his metaphor implied that God did not need to act discreetly or specifically many times to keep his original design working. Thus, he argued that various natural and living systems that manifested design do not require, like those of puppets, the peculiar interposing of the artificer or an intelligent agent employed by him, but perform their function upon particular occasion by virtue of the general and primitive contrivance of the whole engine. So, real quick, I'm going to add some commentary to this. So, basically, when we get these words like mechanism in the field of science, it's coming to the idea that nature can be described as a clock. And this clock, everything, it works on its own. It's automated by itself. So the clock doesn't need anyone to make the clock tick. Of course, it needs a power source. It doesn't need that for the gears to grind and rotate and work on its own. Just like animals, just like humans, we are self-replicating beings. These early scientists would look at everything as a machine, but these machines don't need anybody because the creator created them to be self-sufficient. That's what he's bringing forth. That's the information that Boyle was disseminating and bringing out. Let me keep reading. It says, though Boyle rejected appeals to formal causes in discrete and singular divine action to explain the regular motions of concourse of nature, he explicitly invoked the purposive or intelligent activity of God to explain the original constructions of the universe. The mechanisms that made regularities possible, and especially the diverse creatures of the living world. Indeed, as historians of science Edward Davis has pointed out, Boyle developed several design arguments to explain the origin of animals, the fabric of the universe, and the first formation of the universe. For example, in an essay on the final causes, he argued the wise author of nature has so excellently contrived the universe that the more clearly and particularly we discern how congruous the means are of the ends of the attained by him, the more plainly we discern the admirable wisdom of the omniscient author of things, of whom it is truly said by the prophet Isaiah that he is wonderful in counsel and excellent in working. Consequently, he rejected the so blind a cause as a chance, as an explanation for both orderly concourse of nature and the exquisite structures manifest in living things. So again, it's clear that was a quotation directly from Boyle, and he basically gave credit to the natural world to the omniscient author of things, which is God. Let's keep reading. Both Boyle's advocacy of design argument and his insistence upon finding mechanistic explanations for these processes reflected the influence of the clockwork metaphor. The metaphor implied that the regular workings of nature could be explained by the reference to the interaction of material parts or mechanisms of a system the divine clockmaker had put into nature. It also implied that merely naming those parts and asserting that they resulted from a substantial form or virtue with the same name did not yield any additional understanding of how these things work, nor would invoking the activity of a god at repeated instances to explain how the clock normally works afford deeper insight into immediate causes of the irregularities of the clockwork of nature. At the same time, the clockwork metaphor implied that the system of the universe as a whole, as well as specific living systems, owed their origin to the act of a designing intelligence. Boyle's great divine artificer, God. Edward Davis summarizes Boyle's methodological approach well. diligently pursue the physical causes of things for how science is done, but at the same time recognize that design is sometimes evident in the whole contrivance one is studying. Davis recounts his own experience of attaining access to an original manuscript of Boyle's in the archives of the Royal Society in London and being thunderstruck by the similarity between one of Boyle's design arguments made in the 17th century and the later and more famous 19th century design argument by William Paley. I had the same experience during my first year in the graduate school when I read the same passage in another source. Paley famously asked his readers to imagine stumbling upon a watch on a heath and wondering how the watch happened to be in that place. In such a case, Paley thought that any rational observer would conclude that an intelligent agent had fashioned the watch. Similarly, he argued, every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature. Now, here is a similar passage from Boyle. If an Indian or Chinese should have found a watch cast on shore in the same trunk of the casket or some shipwrecked European vessel, by observing the motions in the figure of it, he would quickly conclude that 'twas made by some intelligent and skillful being. Clearly, Boyle not only assumed the intelligibility of nature, he also thought that the observed evidence in nature of an intelligent designer. Indeed, Davis goes so far to call Boyle the father of the modern theory of intelligent design. The laws of nature. Natural philosophers during the scientific revolution often use another metaphor to characterize the workings of nature. Many began to characterize the natural world as a law-governed realm sought to discover what they called the laws of nature. This metaphor expressed in part an idea implicit in the ones previously discussed. Since many natural philosophers thought that nature could be characterized as a kind of divine clockwork, they expected to observe regularity in the workings of nature. Boyle's analogy, liking God to a skilled watchmaker, expressed a common reverence for both the ingenuity and regularity of divine activity as manifest in the natural world. The mechanical philosophers celebrated the regular concourse of nature as a consequence of God's ingenious design of various mechanistic processes. For example, they thought that the predictable relationship between temperature, pressure, and volume of gas described by Boyle's law derived more fundamentally from the mechanistic interactions of corpuscles of air and their God-given properties. For them, the regularity of natural phenomena derived from the original design of mechanisms that made those phenomena possible, just as the regular movement of the hands of a clock derived from the underlying design of the arrangements of cogs and springs. Nevertheless, many natural philosophers also concede that the laws of nature as a more direct expression of God's orderly governance. To them, the metaphor of the laws of nature expressed a Judeo-Christian understanding of the relationship of nature to God, the divine legislator or governor who sustained the existence of the natural world and assured its orderly working. Thus, many founders of early modern science attribute the regularity in nature not only to God's original design of the natural world, but also to God's constant orderly supervision of it. As the Oxford University History of Science John Hedley Brooke has explained, for Newton, as for Boyle and Descartes, there were laws of nature only because there had been a divine legislator. In other words, this is my commentary, in order for there to be the laws of physics, laws that maintain the universe, laws of gravity, there has to be a lawgiver. That's what a legislator is. So y'all are learning today that the rise of science came from the mind of people who believed in God, theists. It was a theistic tool. That's why they use these metaphors, the book of nature, clock, likening organisms to a clock, and laws. The laws of physics, the laws of gravity, the law of parsimony, all these things being ordered. And the reason why the universe is so orderly, because there is a lawgiver, a divine lawgiver. Let's keep reading. It says, numerous historians and philosophers of science as well as few scientists themselves have made this connection. Some have even identified the Hebrew Bible as the ultimate source of the metaphor. What metaphor? The laws of the universe. Reading on, it says, as the Nobel laureate in University of California, Berkeley chemist Melvin Calvin argued, the notion of an order of nature was discovered 2,000 of 3,000 years ago and enunciated first in the Western world by the ancient Hebrews. I don't think y'all heard that. Let me read it again. The notion of an order of nature was discovered 2,000 or 3,000 years ago and enunciated enunciated first in the Western world by the ancient Hebrews. Calvin notes that the monotheistic worldview of the ancient Hebrews suggested a reason to expect a single coherent order in nature and thus a single universally applicable set of laws governing the natural world. By contrast, because Aminists, polytheists, and pantheists affirmed the existence of many spirits or gods, each possibly interacting with nature in different ways, they had no reason to think that. Natural phenomena would have manifest uniformity and order. The ancient Hebrews, on the other hand, thought that, as Calvin put it, the universe is governed by a single God and is not the product of the whims of many gods, each governing his own province according to his own laws. Calvin, like many historians and philosophers of science, identified this belief in order, loving monotheistic God as the historical foundation for modern science. So the Judeo-Hebraic view that there is a God that orders everything in the universe is the historical foundation for modern science. Again, your children are not going to learn this in school. Let me keep reading. It says, during my studies, one of my supervisors directed me to a seminal article, The Genesis of the Concepts in Physical Law, by historian of science Edgar Zilsel. In it, Zilsel argues that the concept of the laws of nature expresses a juridical metaphor of theological origin. He shows that the first people to conceive nature as an externally governed system were, in fact, the ancient Hebrews. Zilsel notes that various passages from the Bible, from the book of Job, Proverbs, Psalms, and even various prophetic books implied that God had issued laws or decrees that set boundaries on the range of possible natural phenomena. These books of the Bible use the Hebrew word chok, translated variously as law, decree, or commandment, a word often used to describe the category of God's commandments for human beings. Zilsel points out that the Bible also uses this term to describe the limits that God placed upon the potential chaos of the material world. For example, the book of Job describes God as establishing by decrees the exact strength of the force of the wind. Other passages in Job and the book of Jeremiah describe God setting boundaries on the movements and extent of the sea. As Zilsel explains, the idea distinctly implied that the sea to which the divine command is addressed wishes to offer resistance, but being too weak is forced to bow before the supreme power of the Lord. He argues that these biblical passages, as well as the idea of single omnipotent and omniscient deity ruling over nature, decidedly contribute to the formation of the modern concept of the laws of nature during the 17th century. By contrast, Zilsel notes that the ancient Greek or Roman philosophers, including those interested in nature, rarely used the terms laws of nature or natural law. As he explained, in the period of Sophists, the terms law and nature became even opposites, within the term law designating by convention everything that is artificially introduced by men. Similarly, he observes that the optimist philosopher Democritus did not know anything of natural laws, though he attempted to explain all physical phenomena by causes. In addition, Zilsel noted that most prominent Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, simply didn't use the term laws of nature to describe natural phenomena. As he explains, Aristotle never used the law metaphor. Plato uses the term laws of nature only once characterized the behavior of healthy in contrast to the sick human body. Indeed, neither Plato nor Aristotle attempted to identify universal laws that apply to all nature. Plato sought to identify the immaterial forms revealed to the specific material objects. Aristotle sought to identify the four causes, material, formal, efficient, and final, that he thought explained to describe specific objects or organisms. Nevertheless, Aristotle did not attempt to relate these causes to universal and recurring phenomena in nature. Later, Greek and Roman philosophers, as well as Christian philosophers, heavily influenced by ancient Greeks, either lacked the concept of natural laws or did not use it to describe recurring physical phenomena. Epicurean philosophers who were atomists and materialists didn't conceive of nature as law-governed system because they thought the gods didn't care about nature. The Roman Stoics, who recommended living in accord with divine reason as well as attitude of indifference to pleasure and pain, did have a concept of natural law. Nevertheless, they thought of the underlying logos or logic of the universe from which these laws derive, mainly as the source of moral principles that human beings could know by reason. Similarly, many Christians, Neoplatonians, and Christian Aristotelians during the Middle Age did use the term natural law, but only to refer to the moral law knowable by reason, not to the regularities observed by the physical world. Only in the 16th and 17th centuries, after the Western Christianity had begun to rely more heavily on the Bible as a source of authority, and some of the passages discussed above came back into currency, did the terms laws of nature begin to emerge in the writings of philosophers and scientists such as Bacon, Descartes, Kepler, Christian Huygens, Richard Hooker, Boyle, and Newton to describe natural regularities. Zilsels acknowledges one early Greek scientist, Archimedes, who did describe certain phenomena in terms that we would today regard as laws of nature. Nevertheless, Archimedes himself conceived of these laws more self-evident logical principles that were intrinsic to nature and could not logically be otherwise. For example, Archimedes discovered his buoyancy principle, what we now call the law of the lever, and the law of optical reflection. Each of these principles would certainly qualify as a law in modern sense. Archimedes, however, did not call them laws, but instead principles. Moreover, even though he discovered these principles by observation, he presented them as if they were deductions from self-evident logical postulates or axioms, as Euclid did in his works on geometry. Another historian of science, Francis Oakley, made a crucial distinction. He acknowledged that some ancient Greeks discovered principles that he would today regard as laws of nature. Yet, whereas the Greeks conceived of those principles as logically necessary axioms inherent in or internal to nature itself, the scientists during the 17th century began to conceive of the laws of nature as contingent forms of order that were impressed upon nature from the outside by a creator. Since the founders of modern science thought the laws of nature expressed the free will of the divine creator and sustainer of nature, they recognized that whatever order nature exhibits might well have been different had the creator chosen to create or order the natural world differently. This conception of natural law had several beneficial effects on the development of science as we know it today. First, natural philosophers no longer thought they could deduce how nature works from other axioms or first principles. They instead realized that they would need to observe nature in order to discover its law-like regularities. Thus, the concept of impressed or contingent laws of nature encourage empirical observations. Second, since the metaphor of laws of nature implied reliable divine oversight, the metaphor encouraged the use of mathematics to describe natural regularities. To employ philosophical terminology, the metaphor encouraged the development of rational empiricism that combined mathematical description and deduction with careful inductive observation of nature. This mathematizing of the description of natural regularities enabled the prediction and control of nature and eventually fostered unprecedented technological advance. Only a few centuries after Newton characterized the universal law of gravity, human beings harnessed this knowledge to put men on the moon. Actions at a distance and constant spirit action. We've seen that many of the founders of modern science presuppose that orderly concourse of nature reflected the sustaining power and free choice of a divine mind. Natural philosophers committed to such theological voluntarism thus saw the regularities of nature as a contingent expression of God's constant governance of the natural world. Newton's theory of universal gravitation and the uh, controversy it provoked in his lifetime provide additional evidence in support of this thesis. Though physicists today regard Newton as a giant in the field, some of his contemporaries regarded his theory of universal gravitation with considerable skepticism and even suspicion. According to the mechanical philosophers, all natural irregularities were produced by underlying material mechanisms. Thus, all proper scientific explanations needed to invoke some kind of mechanical interaction between the material parts of the objects of the systems. For example, before Newton, physicists such as René Descartes and Christian Huygens proposed a theory of traction, gravitation, in which they envisioned swirling vortices of an invisible but material substance called ether. The ether pushed heavenly bodies around the sun as water pushes floating sticks in a spinning whirlpool. Yet the law of gravity, as proposed by Newton, had no such mechanistic basis. Instead, it involved a mysterious action at a distance, in which the mass of one material body somehow transmitted a force through empty space, attracting the mass of another material body without any physical contact between the two. Thus, Newton attributed, as we do today, the tidal action of the Earth's oceans to the movement of the moon as it orbited around the Earth. Even though the moon and the Earth do not have any direct physical contact. According to Newton, all material objects exert a precise force on other material objects in direct relation to their mass and inverse relation to the square of the distance between them. But the second part of the formulation, the square of the distance between them, was the striking part, and implied that the physical force of gravity was transmitted through empty space across a distance without material or mechanistic interaction, that is, without a material cause. This implication of Newton's theory distressed some of the mechanical philosophers, especially Gottfried Leibniz, who thought that Newton's appeal to action at a distance violated the methodological protocols of the new mechanical philosophy. Not only did Newton's theory fail to identify a physical cause, that is, a pushing or pulling mechanism to explain the motion of heavenly bodies, Leibniz thought Newton's attribution of gravitational motion to gravitational force smacked of the scholastic practice of treating as a cause the name of the effect in question. While teaching, I used to demonstrate what bothered Leibniz to my students by dropping my wallet. I would ask them what caused the wallet to fall. They would answer gravity or gravitational force without thinking too much about their answer. I would then ask them, but what is gravity? They would typically think about the question for a bit and eventually, sometimes with some prompting, come up with answers such as the force that caused things to fall, the tendency for unsupported objects to fall. So I would say, parroting their answers back to them, the things fall because of gravity, but gravity is just the tendency of things to fall. Isn't that circular vacuous? What produces the tendency to fall? If we don't know, have we really identified the cause of gravity, or have we just treated the name of the effect and the question as its own cause? The puzzled look on the faces of my students confirmed that they had begun to understand exactly what gravitational action at a distance bothered Leibniz. Newton only exacerbated Leibniz's concern by acknowledging explicitly that he feigned no knowledge of the cause of the gravitational attraction. Hypothesis non fingo, as he famously put it in Latin. But since Newton refused to propose a mechanism such as swirling ether to explain gravitational motion, Leibniz argued that Newton's law gave refuge to ignorance and laziness by means of an irrational system which maintains not only that there are qualities which we do not understand, of which there are only too many, but further that there are some which could not be comprehended by the greatest intellect if God gave it to every possible opportunity. Moreover, since Newton could not identify any material cause for gravitational action at a distance, Leibniz suspected that Newton secretly might be attributing the motion of the planets and other gravitating objects to the direct governance of an immaterial agent, namely God. Leibniz had good reasons for this suspicion, since all matter gravitated or attracted other matter. The phenomenon could not explain cannot be explained mechanistically as a consequence of motion or interaction of some other matter that was unaffected by gravitational force, by material force external to the body, such as a swirling ether. For example, if Newton had invoked some other mechanism to explain why all matter gravitates, the matter out of which that mechanism was composed would itself gravitate. In that case, the attractive capacity of that matter would itself need explanation, presumably by some other material mechanism. But that would raise the same question all over again, thus quickly denigrating into an infinite regress. To Leibniz, this approach constituted a recourse to absurdities that left only two other options, since Newton's system precluded an appeal to matter external to the body, such as a swirling ether. His theory would need to refer to either some intrinsic property of matter or some immaterial entity as the cause of gravity. But Leibniz thought appealing to the properties internal to the material bodies, a gravitational virtue, an attractive form, or even gravitational force, constituted a return to the vacuous and unintelligible scholastic practice of attributing causal powers to the name of the effect. What if anything, he reasoned, was the difference between saying that gravity is caused by gravitational force and saying that bread nourishes because of the nutritive virtue? Thus, Leibniz argued the only alternative to such absurdities in the Newtonian system was a perpetual miracle. As he stated, if gravitational attraction is not a miraculous, it's false. Let's keep going. Though a theist, Leibniz rejected attributing the regularities in nature to God's direct and constant governance. For Leibniz, a proper respect for the wisdom of God required seeing a pre-established design built into matter from the beginning, not a constant regulation of matter by the divine spirit. As Leibniz argued, God's excellency arises also from his wisdom, whereby his machine lasts longer and moves more regularly than those of any other artist whatsoever. Leibniz saw such a wisdom as a consequence of a primitive active force or intellectually embodied in all corporeal substances, ensuring the orderly progression of the material world according to God's purposes. In Leibniz's view, matter expresses purposes from within and gives a physical, not a spiritual basis for the regularities of nature. Thus, whereas Newton perceived the ongoing continuous activity of God in upholding the law of gravity, Leibniz thought of God's creative activity as a consequence of the infusion of his design into all matter at its creation. He therefore expected gravity could be explained by references to some mechanism. Consequently, Leibniz believed that Newton's refusal to posit such a mechanism violated the division of labor and that Boyle had established between natural philosophers and theologians. The former, whom he today calls scientists, were to describe the ongoing operation and regularities of nature by reference to the underlying physical mechanisms, such as swirling vortices or interactions of corpuscles of air. While the theologians and natural theologians were to engage in identifying evidence of design and the origin of the mechanisms, thus Leibniz sought to place Newton's new theory on the horns of a dilemma. Either universal gravitation represented a return to an outdated scholastic practice, or it brought divine actions into science where it did not, in Leibniz's view, belong. Either way, Leibniz asserted that Newton's theory relied on occult rather than mechanical causes. Mr. Boyle, he observed, would never have allowed such a chimerical notion. In his dispute with Leibniz, Newton defended the rigor and legitimacy of his new theory. He did so on the basis of his ability to describe with mathematic precision the motions of the heavenly bodies and the forces acting on fallen bodies. However, mysterious such as an action at distance might be, Newton also thought that his use of mathematics to describe universal phenomena, such as gravitational attraction, represented an advance over the practice of trying to imagine a mechanical explanation for every specific class of phenomena. Indeed, mechanical models like vortices theory of gravitation or the spring model of air pressure tended to claim applicability only to the specific process. Newton found this less intellectually satisfying than discovering laws that applied to all matter in grand mathematical synthesis that he advanced in the Principia. Still, Newton likely did hold the view that Leibniz suspected. He seemed to affirm in private correspondence that he thought an immaterial agent, God, was responsible for the mysterious action that his law described. In a letter to Bishop Richard Bentley written in 1692, after his dispute with Leibniz, Newton implied that he thought that gravity must be the cause by an agent acting constantly according to the certain laws. Newton did add the caveat, whether this agent be material or immaterial, I had left open to the consideration of my readers. Nevertheless, it seems Newton was being coy. Early in the same letter, Newton had already affirmed Bentley's explicitly theistic interpretation of Newton's view. Bishop Bentley had written to Newton as he was preparing to give lecture funded by the bequest from Robert Boyle. The Boyle lectures were endowed to highlight the evidence for the existence of God from studies of nature. Bentley wrote to Newton asking him to clarify whether he thought God was responsible for the attraction between material bodies separated by empty space, or whether gravitational attraction derived from intrinsic material property of the material bodies themselves. In his letter, Bentley depicted Newton's cause of gravity as follows. 'Tis inconceivable that inanimate brute matter should, without a divine impression, operate upon and affect other matter without mutual contact. Newton's affirmed Bentley interpretation and replied, the last clause of your second position I like very well. 'Tis inconceivable that inanimate brute matter should, without the mediation of something else which is not material, operate upon, affect other matter without mutual contact, as it must if gravitation be essential and inherent in it. Here, Newton leaves no doubt as to his own view. He specifically rejects an inconceivable idea that brute matter could cause action at a distance, i.e., move other matter without mutual contact. Instead, he affirms that constantly acting agent responsible for gravity must be something else which is not material. This statement occurs in the context of Newton's response to Bentley's query, which whether Newton thought that matter could operate upon and affect other matter at a distance without a defined impression. Consequently, it clearly shows that Newton himself regarded the ultimate cause of gravity as constant spirit action, as one of my Cambridge supervisors characterized his view during a memorable tutorial. Newton also seemed to betray his own view of the cause of gravitational attraction publicly in a passage in the General Scholium to the Principia, an epilogue to the main work that he included in later editions, partly as a reply to his critics. There he says explicitly, in him, God, are all things contained and moved. These and many other passages also suggest that Newton affirmed the conception of natural law that historians have perceived in writings of many founders of modern science. Newton and his followers clearly regarded what we call the laws of nature as a mode of divine action and governance of the natural world. The laws of nature not only reflected the past action of a divine creator who established the conditions necessary for orderly and regular natural processes, but the fundamental laws of nature also depend upon the ongoing and sustaining activity of a divine legislator. As the University of Cambridge historian of science Simon Scaffer has explained, Newton thought what we call the laws of nature manifested the essentially divine will evident in the common concourse of nature. I know that was a bit wordy, but it's clear that Newton was a proponent of God, and he used God as an explanatory tool to explain the nature of the universe. You understand? Right. Shout out to R.A. Nasi. Excellent topic. Very ironic that some of the earliest sciences understood that the study of natural world and its phenomena would be fruitless if there existed no order through by grand design. Exactly. R.A. also says, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, either were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolishness heart was darkened. Yeah, Romans 1:21. This book is dropping so many gems, and it was just recently published. How did you hear about it? Thanks for sharing this crucial information. I knew about it because he advertised it. I follow Dr. Meyer. I've been following him for a while. And he advertised it, and he said he was going to drop the book, and I pre-ordered it as soon as I was able to pre-order it, and it came out last month, so I was able to get my hands on it. Shalom, Brother Sean. All right, let's get back into the book. The importance of design arguments during the scientific revolution. Each of these three metaphors, the book of nature, the clockwork of nature, the laws of nature, express and presuppose belief in a divine creator and or sustainer of the natural world. Nevertheless, many of the founders of modern science did not just assume or assert by faith that the universe had been designed by an intelligent agent. They also argued for this hypothesis based on discoveries in their fields of study. Johannes Kepler perceived intelligent design in the mathematical precision of planetary motion and three laws he discovered that describe that motion. Robert Boyle insisted that the intricate clock-like regularity of physical law for design based upon the ease with which plants and animals fell into orderly groups within groups systems of classification. Many other individual scientists made specific design arguments based upon empirical discoveries in their fields. This tradition attained an almost majestic rhetorical quality in the writings of Newton. Newton not only viewed gravitational action at a distance as a manifestation of God's power, but he also made many powerful design arguments based upon other biological and astronomical discoveries. Newton viewed the order described by the laws of nature as a mode of divine action, but he also thought that many specific arrangements of matter, each subject to those laws, gave evidence of the design of intelligent and powerful being. For example, in the Optics, his major treatise on light, Newton argued that the uncanny match between optical properties of light and the structure of the mammalian eye suggested foresight in design. As he explained, how came the bodies of animals to be contrived with so much art? And for what end were there several parts? Was the eye contrived without skill in optics and the ear without knowledge of sounds? And these things being rightly dispatched, does it not appear from a phenomena that there is a being incorporeal, living, intelligent, and omnipresent? Writing in a general scholium, the epilogue of the Principia, Newton suggested that the stability of the planetary systems depended not only upon the regular action of a universal gravitation, but also upon precise initial positioning of planets and comets in relation to the sun. As he explained, though these bodies may indeed preserve in their orbits by the mere laws of gravity, they could by no means have at first derived the regular positions of the orbits themselves from those laws. Thus, this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of the intelligent and powerful being. As John Hedley Brooke has pointed out, Newton thought that knowledge of God's power and wisdom could be inferred from the intelligence seemingly displayed in the design of nature. Many historians of science, the kind you encounter in physics textbooks or in new atheist books and videos, claim that Newton depicted a mechanistic universe, an autonomous, self-organizing, and self-maintaining world machine, one that left no place for the activity of a divine creator, sustainer, or legislator of nature. This view misrepresents Newton in three ways. First, he rejected the idea of gravity with a mysterious action at a distance could be explained by a mechanistic cause. Second, Newton thought that laws of nature expresses God's way of ordering brute matter through the constant action of its will and spirit. Third, Newton saw evidence of initial acts of intelligent design in the complex configuration of matter in both the solar system and biological systems. From Newton to Dawkins, presuppositions derived from a Judeo-Christian worldview help to inspire and shape the foundation of modern science. And the founders of modern science themselves perceive evidence in support of those presuppositions, including the idea that life and the universe owe their origin to the activity of a being incorporeal, living, intelligent, and omnipresent. How then did we get from Newton to Dawkins? How did the theistic foundations interpretations of the scientific enterprise in the 16th and 17th and early 18th centuries give way by the 19th and 20th centuries to the perception of the conflict or even warfare between science and religious belief? How did the ideas that nature displays the handiwork of the Creator, central to the vigorous program of natural theology advanced by scientists such as Kepler, Boyle, and Newton, get completely overturned, so that the world's best-selling science popularizers in the 21st century could write a book claiming that science properly understood renders belief in God so incredibly improbable as to effectively a delusion? Clearly, an enormous intellectual shift has occurred in the West since the founding of modern science. But what caused it? Chapter 3, the rise of scientific materialism and the eclipse of theistic science. Belief in a rational and intellectual creator inspired development of modern science. Yet after the 18th century, this understanding gave way to a perception advanced by many powerful voices that science and religious belief are at war. What produced this dramatic shift? Early in my study of the history and philosophy of science, I found myself confronted with the question. During my first year at Cambridge, I developed a particular fascination with Newton and the way in which he so closely integrated his theistic and even biblical ideas into the development of the most foundational theories of physics. As one of my supervisors put it to me, if you miss Newton's theism, you missed everything. Newton not only had profoundly theistic philosophy of nature, but he also developed several compelling, at least at the time, arguments for natural theology, that is, arguments for the existence of God based upon observation of complex systems in the natural world. I didn't have to go far, however, to find evidence of the opposite view of what science tells us. As I read the works of the late 19th century biologists, I came face to face with an entirely different philosophy of science. Science, then, the one that had inspired the scientific revolution. During this period, just as scientists were beginning to formulate theories of the origin and evolution of the life of Earth, the worldview known as scientific materialism, which I introduced in the prologue, began to dominate thinking about the meaning of science. Its rise followed a movement in the history of philosophy during the 18th century of the historians called the Enlightenment. Intellectual historians and historians of science typically identify the shift away from the theistic foundations of modern science with three major developments in Western intellectual history. First, the Enlightenment idea that humans' reasons could replace and function autonomously from religious belief. Second, the increasing skepticism about the existence of God, or at least about the soundness of the arguments for God's existence, among many Enlightenment philosophers. And third, the rise of scientific materialism with it both new norms and scientific practice in a worldview allegedly based on science that affirms matter and energy rather than God as the fundamental reality from which everything else comes. Reason and religion during the Enlightenment. Newton died in 1727. In the years following, scientists continued to demonstrate the power of the systematic investigation of nature. Increasingly, Enlightenment philosophers extolled the virtues of reason and science over religion as a source of authority and knowledge. Indeed, many philosophers viewed science and reason generally as a source of authority that could and should replace revealed religion. The idea seemed increasingly appealing in Europe after centuries of strife and warfare pitting Catholics and Protestants against each other, waged in part over competing claims about sources of religious authority. After the ravages of 30 Years' War, 1618-48, many Europeans felt exhausted by religious conflict, leaving them open to new perspectives, even radically new ones. In addition, French philosophers such as Voltaire and later Comte, writing after the Enlightenment, viewed science as perhaps the best example of the power of human reason and the most reliable source of knowledge. They assumed that science could function autonomously from religious belief, and thus independently from presuppositions such as intelligibility, contingency, and uniformity of nature. That Christian theism supplied as part of the original epistemological foundation of modern science. Natural philosophers or scientists, as the English philosopher William Whewell dubbed them in 1833, still sought to discover the laws of nature and mechanisms of the great clockwork of nature. But these metaphors gradually lost their original theological connotations. At least they did so far. So, for many Enlightenment philosophers who characterized science as purely secular enterprise and depicted reason and revelation as opposites. One prominent Enlightenment philosopher specifically appropriated the idea of the laws of nature as reason to reject theistic belief. The skeptical empiricist David Hume argued that lawful concourse of nature precluded the possibility of miraculous intervention by a transcendent God. Miracles, he said, are impossible because they violate the laws of nature. He depicted these laws as autonomous entities rather than descriptions of how God normally chooses to order material world, as Newton and earlier scientists had believed. Hume justified his rejection of the possibility of miracles by insisting that uniform or repeating human experience demonstrated that the natural laws could not be violated. As he explained, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as firm and unalterable experience had established these laws, the proof against miracle from very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly imagine. Hume advanced the theory of knowledge known as radical empiricism. Empiricism asserts that observations of the natural world through the five senses offer the only sure path to knowledge. As such, it provides the only reliable source of ideas in our minds. Hume's rejection of the possibility of miracles reflected this view because they asserted that uniform humans through the senses had established the laws of nature, and human beings had never observed any exception to them. As he noted, nothing is esteemed a miracle if it ever happened in the common course of nature. Thus, Hume not only argued that miracles violate laws of nature, he also argued that our experience has established that what we call natural laws admit no exceptions. In short, miracles violate the laws of nature, and the laws of nature could not be violated, therefore miracles are impossible. Hume's argument against nature implied that only kind of God that could exist, if any existed at all, would be a remote deistic being who never intervened or otherwise acted discreetly or discernibly in nature. Hume's radical empiricism further implied, if subtly, that belief of God itself could not have a sound basis in reasons because God fails to qualify as a sort of entity that human beings could observe through five senses. The French philosopher Auguste Comte, another radical empiricist and the founder of philosophy of science known as positivism, advanced an even more explicit dichotomy between science and religious belief. Writing in 1840s, he maintained that the advanced knowledge occurred in three phases: a theological phase, a philosophical phase, and finally a positive or scientific phase. Comte argued that in the theological phase, people invoked the mysterious actions of gods to explain natural phenomena, whether electrical storms or the spread of contagious disease. In a second, more advanced metaphysical stage, philosophers offered abstract concepts like Plato's forms or Aristotle's final causes as explanations of natural phenomena. According to Comte, human beings only attain real or positive knowledge when they replace such superstitions and abstractions and explain natural phenomena by reference to natural laws or strictly material mechanisms. Thus, he secularized two of the theological metaphors, nature as a mechanism and lawful realm, that had previously expressed the theistic inspiration for doing science. Let me add some commentary here. So these secularists that came out of the French Enlightenment era, they took these terms, they hijacked these terms that came from theistic implications that implied that God was the supreme or prime mover of the universe. Mechanisms, the clock analogy, many of these things were hijacked by these secularists, and they took God out of the picture. Let's keep reading. It says, moreover, he insisted that the science properly practiced could make no reference to divine action to explain any events or phenomena. Instead, he explaining these scientifically or positively required showing how such phenomena explain the laws of nature, now understood as entities that existed autonomously from the divine will or governance of nature. The demise of theistic arguments. A growing skepticism among Enlightenment philosophers about the classical arguments for God's existence, about the God hypothesis, provided an additional reason for the secularization of knowledge. During the late 18th century, leading philosophers such as David Hume and Immanuel Kant denied the soundness of the two of the classical and most formidable arguments for God's existence from nature. Hume raised powerful philosophical objections to design argument. Kant expressed skepticism about the cosmological argument, though not necessarily the design argument of the existence of God. The classical design argument begins by noting certain highly ordered or complex features in nature, such as the configurations of planets or the architecture of the vertebrate eye. It proceeds to argue that such features must have arisen from the activity of a pre-existent intelligence, typically equated with God. The cosmological argument assumes the principles of causality or the principle of sufficient reason, the idea that every event must have a cause or a reason for its occurrence or existence. And it seeks to deduce a necessary being, that is God, as the first cause or sufficient reason for the universe's existence. Medieval Muslims scholar developed one of the most famous versions of the cosmological argument, known as the Kalam argument. It asserted that the universe had a temporal beginning, a proposition that philosophers typically sought to justify by showing the logical or mathematical absurdity of an infinite regress of cause and effect. The argument concluded that the beginning of the physical universe must have resulted from an uncaused first cause that exists independently of the universe. The argument was typically expressed in a syllogism. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause. The universe begins to exist. The universe must have a cause for its existence. By further steps of reasoning, proponents of Kalam argument deduced that the necessary first cause of the universe must transcend the physical universe, since a cause is necessary separate from its effects, and must be personal, since only a personal agent can discreetly to initiate a new line of causation without its actions being caused by a prior set of necessary and sufficient material conditions. Finally, proponents of the Kalam argument equated the first transcendent and personal cause with God. Throughout Western history, many philosophers and scientists have formulated arguments for the existence of God, some based upon the observation of the natural world. Consequently, many Western thinkers also view science and theistic belief as mutually reinforcing. So at this time, this is my commentary, science and theistic belief was not at war with each other. It was mutually reinforcing. They worked together. Like the causation argument. If the universe has a beginning, something outside of it had to create or spark or cause that beginning. That's what the Kalam argument was. All right, let's keep reading. It said, yet skepticism about the most empirically based theistic arguments, such as the cosmological and design arguments, gradually became more pervasive after the end of the 18th century, largely because of developments within philosophy that were later reinforced by new scientific theories or interpretations of them. The demise of the cosmological argument. The philosopher Immanuel Kant, for example, undermined confidence in the cosmological argument. He did so by casting doubt on the validity of the second premise of the argument, the one affirming that the universe must have a beginning. Instead, he argued that the question of whether the universe was finite or infinite in time could not be decided by reasons. He thought that reason could lead to equally rational but contradictory conclusions, or antinomies, namely that the universe did and did not have a beginning in time. In his view, the universe might have had a beginning in time, but it could have had also resulted in an unbroken line of efforts and causes going back infinitely. Let me add commentary to that. That's still being pushed today. There's a sector of scientists that are pushing what they call the Big Mouse, not the Big Bang, where the universe is contracting and expanding, contracting and expanding. It expands and then it shrinks and expands again. So effectively saying that the universe is eternal. It has no beginning or no end. It just starts over and it dies and then it's reborn again. Um, to put it in layman terms. All right, so let's keep reading. It says, in other words, Kant accepted the possibility that the universe might be eternal and self-existent. He did not argue, as Aristotle had done, that the idea of creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing, was logically incoherent. But he did regard the conclusion of the Coulomb argument as uncertain. Kant's philosophical skepticism about the cosmological first cause argument was reinforced by the science of the day. Though Newton supported the design argument, one aspect of his physics, his postulations of infinite space, helped to undermine the classical Coulomb argument. According to Newton's theory of universal gravitation, all bodies attract one another with a force proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. His theory implied that all bodies of matter in the universe attract one another, yet this created a puzzle. According to Newton's theory, every star should gravitate toward the center of the universe until the whole universe collapses in on itself. To explain the current stability of the universe, Newton proposed that the matter was evenly diffused through an infinite space so that it would never convene into one mass. He thought that there were an infinite number of stars scattered evenly throughout a universe of infinite space. Then every star would attract every other star with the equal force in all directions. Thus, the stars will remain forever suspended in a tension of balanced gravitational attraction. Newton also found the infinite universe appealing for theological reasons. He thought the space of divine sensorium a medium which God perceived creation. Since God was infinite, space had to be as well. Physicists with a more materialistic outlook later found Newton's infinite universe philosophically agreeable. Some extended the infinite static universe model by assuming that if space must be infinite, then time must be infinite in both the forward and reverse directions. An infinite universe in a kind of steady state or gravitational equilibrium, neither expanding nor contracting, lacked dynamic motion that would suggest either a beginning or an end. Thus, Newton's affirmation of spatially infinite universe seemed to many physicists to imply a temporally infinite universe as well. Thus, skepticism about the idea that the universe had a beginning in time undermines support for or interest in Coulomb's argument. The demise of the design argument. During the Enlightenment, the design argument also came under attack. Most design arguments then and in currency had an analogical character. They likened to the analogized living organisms of complex human artifacts, such as watches or clocks. Since such complex machines derive from the activity of an intelligent agent, the much more complex machinery evident in living organisms must also have originated from a design in mind. Hume took aim at this reasoning in his dialogues concerning natural religion in 1779. He argued that design arguments depended upon a flawed analogy with human artifacts. He admitted that artifacts derived from intelligent artificers and that biological organisms have certain similarities to complex human artifacts. Eyes and watches both depend upon the functional integration of many separate and specifically configured parts. Nevertheless, he argued biological organisms also differ from human artifacts. They reproduce themselves, for example, and that advocates of the design argument fail to take these dissimilarities into account. Since experience teaches that organisms always come from other organisms, Hume argued that an analogical argument really ought to suggest that organisms ultimately come from some primeval organism, perhaps a giant spider or vegetable, not a transcendent mind or spirit. Yet Hume's categorical rejection of the design argument did not prove entirely decisive with either theistic or secular philosophers. Thinkers as diverse as Kant and Scottish Presbyterian Thomas Reid. The Enlightenment theist Thomas Paine and the English philosopher William Whewell continue to affirm various versions of design argument. Indeed, science-based design arguments continued at least into the early 19th century in works such as William Paley's Natural Theology in 1802. I want to make some quick commentary. So we can clearly see before Darwin, you had people like Hume arguing that all biological life came from simpler life or earlier primeval organism before Darwin. So he wasn't the one to come up or originate that idea. Let's keep reading. Paley cataloged a host of biological systems that suggested the work of superintending intelligence. Paley argued that astonishing complexity and superb adaptation of means to the ends such as systems could not originate strictly through blind forces of nature. Paley also responded directly to Hume's claim that the design inference rested upon a faulty analogy at which that could reproduce itself. He argued that would constitute an even more marvelous effect than one that could not. Thus, for Paley, the differences between artifacts and organisms only seem to strengthen the conclusion of design. Moreover, well into the 19th century, many scientists continue to find Paley's watchmaker reasoning compelling. Other works of English natural theology during the first half of the 19th century, such as the famed Bridgewater treatises, also demonstrated the continuing popularity of design arguments, especially in Britain, despite Hume's well-known objections. Indeed, it is not ultimately the argument of the philosophers that began to erode the popularity of the design argument, but the emergence of increasingly powerful materialistic explanations of apparent design. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection stands out particularly. And on The Origin of Species, published in 1859, Darwin argued that living organisms previously considered the most obvious examples of God's creative power only appeared to be designed. Darwin proposed a concrete mechanism, natural selection, acting on random variations that could explain the adaptation of organisms to their environment and other evidences of apparent design, without invoking an actual intelligent or directing agency. If the origin of the biological organisms could be explained naturalistically, as Darwin argued, then explanations invoking a creative intelligence were unnecessary and even vacuous. The rise of scientific materialism. The success of new scientific theories about astronomical, geological, and biological origins contributed to the rejection of theism as an explanatory framework for science. These new theories collectively seem to support alternative worldview of scientific materialism. For example, in 1796, the French physicist Pierre Laplace attempted to explain the origin of the solar system not as a product of the design of an intelligent and powerful being, as Newton had done, but as a result of purely natural gravitational forces. In the book, The System of the World, Exposition System du Monde, Laplace outlined a scenario by which planets may have formed from the hot atmospheric gases surrounding the sun and other rotating stars, known as the nebular hypothesis. Laplace's theory provided an evolutionary and wholly materialistic account of the origin of the solar system. As he asks, could not the arrangement of the planets itself and effect of the laws of motion, could not the supreme intelligence which Newton makes to interfere, make it depend on a more general phenomenon, such as a nebulous matter distributed in various masses throughout the immensity of the heavens? Beginning in 1798, Laplace published a treatise of celestial mechanics. A multi-volume companion to his earlier work, he described the ongoing operation of the solar system in precise mathematical detail. In 1802, he presented some of the work to the new French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. According to later and possibly apocryphal reports, when Napoleon eventually summoned Laplace to discuss his work, he questioned the scientists directly about the role of God in the origin of the solar system. The emperor asked, "They tell me you have written a large book on the systems of the universe and have never even mentioned its creator." Laplace reportedly issued the now famous reply, "Sire, I had no need of that hypothesis." Historians are uncertain about whether Laplace actually said these words, in part because the first reported quotations of them don't appear until 1825. Yet the earliest reports of the encounter certainly capture a shift in the perspective about whether the God hypothesis could play an explanatory role in any aspect of the natural sciences. The English astronomer Sir William Herschel, the only eyewitness to the encounter between Laplace and Napoleon, reports that in response to the First Council, Napoleon asked Laplace, "And who is the author of all this?" Laplace replied by indicating, as Herschel paraphrases his response, "A chain of natural causes would account for the construction and preservation of the wonderful system." And clearly, Laplace's treatise and his earliest system of the world provided a fully naturalistic account, not only of the ongoing operation of the celestial system, but also its origin. Thus, Laplace's work marked a change in approach among many scientists. Developments in other fields supported this trend. In geology, Charles Lyell explained the origin of the Earth's most dramatic topographical features, mountain ranges and canyons, as a result of slow, gradual, and completely naturalistic processes of change. In biology, as noted, Darwin's evolutionary theory sought to show that the blind process of natural selection acted on random variations accounted for origin of new forms of life without any divine guidance. Living organisms only appear to be designed, as biologist Francisco Ayala has explained. The functional design of organisms and their features would seem to argue for the existence of a designer. It was Darwin's greatest accomplishment, however, to show that the directive organization of living organisms can be explained as a result of natural processes, natural selection, without any need to resort to a creator or other external agent. As I mentioned in the prologue, every worldview on a metaphysical system must address the question of the origins. The writer James Meyer has called this the prime reality question. The question, what is the thing or the entity or the process from which everything else comes? By the end of the 19th century, scientists have formulated a reasonably comprehensive set of entirely materialistic theories, sketching the origin and development of life, including human life, back to the origin of Earth and the solar system. Perhaps not surprisingly, then a worldview arose at the time, scientific materialism, that claimed to offer comprehensive materialistic answer to prime reality question, based upon several then popular scientific theories. Changing norms, the role of methodological naturalism. It wasn't just perceived a success of materialistic theories of origins that banished God or the design hypothesis. New scientific norms and practices emerged during the 19th century, making the God hypothesis seem, if not false, at least increasingly irrelevant. As historian of science Neil Gillespie argues that in his classic work, Charles Darwin and the Problem of Creation, the exclusion of design hypothesis was reinforced by emerging tradition that increasingly sought to exclude appeals to divine or intelligent causes from science by definition. Gillespie also attributed the emerging positivist episteme in part of the influence of the philosopher Auguste Comte. Other historians and philosophers see the emergence of a strictly naturalistic methodological convention more as a natural consequence of the practices of theistic sciences themselves. Steve Fuller has noted in correspondence with me that disagreements among the theists about the explanatory role of God in science, such as disagreement between Newton and Leibniz discussed in the previous chapter, contributed to the rise of strictly materialistic approach to scientific explanation. Uncertainties among theists about how to invoke God appropriately as a scientific explanation left scientists increasingly inclined to consider only naturalistic explanations. Either way, scientists increasingly understood that scientific theories should limit themselves to positing only materialistic entities or natural processes in scientific explanations. Positing creative intelligence violated such spoken or unspoken methodological norms. For example, in The Origin of Species, Darwin repeatedly argued against the scientific status of the perceived theory of creation. He often faulted his rivals not just for their inability to devise explanations for certain biological data, but for their inability to offer scientific explanations at all. Indeed, some of Darwin's arguments for his theory of descent with modification depended not only on newly discovered facts, but upon facts such as homology, similar structures in otherwise different animals, and fossil progression that neither stymied nor puzzled contemporary paleontologists such as Louis Agassiz and taxonomists such as Richard Owens. Both of these eminent scientists thought such phenomena reflected prior active mind or the plan of creation. But in Darwin's view, explanations pointed to an immaterial mind, idea, or plan did not, in principle, qualify as proper scientific explanations. What he questioned in his attack against his rivals was not just the ability to explain the evidence, but rather the scientific legitimacy of any theory that failed to offer the materialistic cause for observable phenomena. Thus, Darwin dismissed Owen's explanation of similarity of anatomical structures in different animals by references to the plan of creation, saying, but that is not a scientific explanation. Darwin's assumption about what scientific theories must look like influenced the way he made his case in The Origin of Species. It also established new methodological norms that prohibited explanations from invoking creative intelligence or intelligent design in the history of life. Norms prescribing such appeals contributed to the repudiation of the theistic design argument during and after the late 19th century. Of course, the perceived success of the fully naturalistic theories of origin in astronomy, geology, especially biology, reinforced this trend. These theories taken jointly suggested that the whole history of the universe could be told as nearly seamless unfolding potentially of matter and energy. The default cosmology in the 19th century, which assumed that matter and energy were eternal and self-existent, reinforced this materialistic perspective, since it seemed to eliminate any need to consider the question of the ultimate origin of matter. Darwin, Marx, and Freud, a comprehensive materialism. So before we read on, I want to touch on um, Darwin, the undermining Owens, but he's using Owens' homology, his classification system, the classifications of animal, mammalian, and so on and so forth as a framework, but he dismissed everything Owen brought to the table as far as these were archetypes from a plan of creation. So when people say that we're primates, that comes from Richard Owen. Richard Owen classified us as primates because we have similar bone structure, saying that we were all archetypes made by um, by a creator. So they hijacked that, and now they say, well, we have similar bone structures because we evolved from a common ancestor. But that was not the original usage of homology. All right, so let's read on. Darwin, Marx, and Freud, a comprehensive materialism. In addition to Darwin, two other late 19th century and early 20th century figures contributed to this increasingly entrenched worldview. Both did so by developing influential social scientific theories in economics and social philosophy. Karl Marx, dialectical materialism in his utopian vision of future based upon it, expressed a profoundly deterministic as well as materialistic understanding of human nature. In psychology, Sigmund Freud formulated a complex characterization of the human psyche, describing the different elements and animating motivations or objectives of each part of the mind, in the process painting a strikingly deterministic vision of human nature, whereas Marx depicted human beings as determined by material needs and impersonal economic forces. Freud portrayed behavior as dictated by largely unconscious sexual desires. Both Marx and Freud were atheists who expressed disdain for the God hypothesis. Marx regarded religion as an opiate propagated by the bourgeois elite to anesthetize the working class to their exploitation. Freud also thought that the belief in God served as a utilitarian end. He thought that human beings had invented the myth of a benevolent God to provide a comforting father figure as a psychological crutch to compensate for difficult relationships with their actual earthly fathers. Thus, the famous dictum reversing the Judeo-Christian creation story, God did not create man, man created God. With these three great figures, Darwin, Marx, and Freud, science seemed to answer many of the deepest worldview questions that heretofore Judeo-Christian religion had answered for people in the West. As I explained somewhat aphoristically in conference talks, Darwin told us where we came from, Marx told us where we are going, and Freud told us about human nature and what to do about our guilt. All three claim to base their theories on scientific evidence and analysis. Thus, by the early 20th century, science seemed to support, if could be said to support anything, a materialistic worldview, not a theistic one. Science no longer needed to invoke a pre-existent mind to shape matter in order to explain the evidence of nature. Matter had always existed and could, in fact, arrange itself without a pre-existing designer or creator. Scientific materialism and relationship between science and faith. Not surprisingly, the rise of scientific materialism altered the way many intellectuals conceptualized the relationship between science and theistic belief. Many 20th century scientists, philosophers, and theologians perceive science and the theistic belief as standing in overt conflict with one another. The view promulgated by John William Draper and Andrew Dixon White in their late 19th century revisionist history, and later aggressively popularized by the new atheists. We have seen most historians of science now regard extremely simplistic attempts to cast the whole history of science as a battle between science and Christianity. Nevertheless, it does not follow that such conflict has never existed. Many 20th century scientists and philosophers have advanced the conflict model as at least the correct current, if not past, understanding. Scientists and philosophers holding this view assert that even if science and religion were not in conflict in past, they are now. Many conflict advocates cite the ascendancy of Darwinian thinking with its denial of its actual as opposed merely apparent design in living systems as the principal and irreconcilable locus of this conflict. If theism asserts that creative intelligence played a key role in the origin of living forms, and if evolutionary biology can account for the origin of the living organisms by reference of wholly undirected material processes, then one of these two views must be incorrect. Leading proponents of evolutionary theory such as Francisco Ayala and later William Provine, Douglas Futuyma, and Richard Dawkins, and the late George Gaylord Simpson agree that neo-Darwinianism denies any discernible evidence of design or guidance in the history of life. Neo-Darwinianism teaches, as Simpson once put it, that man is the result of purposeless natural processes that did not have him in mind. Or as Ayala avers, neo-Darwinianism explains design without a designer. Of course, it does not follow from the truth of neo-Darwinism some other materialistic evolutionary theory that a deity could not possibly exist. Even popular proponents of scientific atheism, including Dawkins and Nye, admit that science cannot categorically exclude that possibility. They do not deny the possibility of a designer whose creative activity is so masked in apparently natural processes that it escapes scientific detection. Yet for most evolutionary biologists, such as undetectable entity hardly seems worthy of consideration. As Dawkins has argued, if the appearance of design can now be fully explained by natural causes, then surely it is simpler to attribute the appearance of design directly to such causes rather than invoking an additional factor, an undetectable designer. Although the existence of such designer has remained a logical possibility, the vast majority of evolutionary biologists and certainly new atheists have rejected the idea as an unnecessary and unparsimonious explanation. At the very least, neo-Darwinian Neo-Darwinism makes theological explanations of life superfluous, as evolutionary biologist Douglas Fukumoya writes. Other scientists have argued, however, that since science has not definitely disproved the existence of God, it does not necessarily contradict religious belief, even though explicitly theistic explanations for the origin and development of life may be unnecessary. Those who advance the new typically portray this view typically portrays science and religion as such distinct enterprises that their teachings do not intersect in significant ways. They also usually deny that the deistic religion, properly understood, makes any factual claims about humans or natural history. It claims that only about morality and meaning. For example, paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, in his book Rock of Ages, advanced the idea that science and religion exemplify completely separate forms of inquiry, addressing completely different kinds of questions. He argues that each have the authority to speak only in their own separate realms, reflecting what he called their non-overlapping magisteria, popularly abbreviated NOMA. Though Gould, an agnostic with strong atheistic leanings, advanced this view in 1999 as an olive branch as of sorts to religious believers, many theists had already advanced similar formulations. British neuroscientist Donald Mackay, physicist Howard Van Til, and biologist Jean Pond developed two such models known as complementarily associated with Mackay and Van Til and compartmentalism or independence. Prominent theologians and philosophers such as Karl Barth, Soren Kierkegaard, and Martin Buber affirm similar views. Like Gould's nomus concept, these models asserted a religious and metaphysical neutrality of scientific knowledge. Advocates of compartmentalism and complementarity developed their models to defend theistic belief against the aggressive philosophical materialism of many conflict theories. Even so, advocates of these models have generally conceded that the failure of science-based theistic arguments. Instead, advocates of independence and complementarity or partnership in Van Til's lexicon have argued that materialistic origins theories do not necessarily contradict theological accounts of creation. Real quick, I'm gonna give some. I know we've been going for some hours, but I want to give some commentary on that. You have theistic evolutionists today that believe in evolution, Darwinian evolution, but they plug in God. They still believe God was behind evolution. So what they're saying is it's really complementary more than opposed, because you do have people that come from that school of thought and and ideology. So reading on, it says, since God may have used Darwinian or other similarly materialistic processes to create new forms of life. In their view, statements by scientists about the purposelessness of evolution do not represent scientific statements per se, but instead represent evolutionism, an extra scientific or pseudoscientific apologetic for philosophical materialism. Even so, advocates of independence and complementarity generally have agreed with staunch Darwinists on one point. Both deny the evidence of intelligent design is scientifically detectable, and both agree more generally that scientific evidence does not and cannot provide positive support for theistic belief. Clearly, the very existence of the independence of complementarity perspectives show that the demise of the theistic argument did not eliminate theistic belief, even among scientists. Some prominent 19th century scientists such as Michael Faraday, Louis Agassiz, and James Clerk Maxwell, giants in their respective fields of chemistry, paleontology, and physics, even continued to advance the natural theological tradition inaugurated by Boyle and Newton. Nevertheless, many theists in the sciences, since they have adopted a more compartmentalized view of the relationship between science and religion, thus, the demise of theistic arguments and the rise of scientific materialism radically changed the terms of engagement between science and religion. Although many scientists came to regard the witness of science as hostile to a theistic worldview, others began to view it as entirely neutral. Few, however, have thought, in contrast to the founders of early modern science like Kepler, Boyle, and Newton, that the testimony of nature or science actually supports belief in God. By the beginning of the 20th century, science, despite its theistic beginnings, seemed to have no need of the God hypothesis. So that's the end of that chapter there. Part 2, Return of the God hypothesis. I will cover this soon. I will cover this part of the book soon. I know this book was very, very wordy and lengthy, but I would like to continue. I want to complete this book on the channel. So bear with me. But in short, summarize everything we read. We went over the origins of modern science. We went over the rise of theistic science, the implications of it, why they thought that God necessitated the need of laws and what they were observing in the universe as far as gravity. If there's laws of nature, then there must be a lawgiver, a legislator, a divine legislator. The Kalam's argument, that if there's a beginning, if the universe has a beginning, there must be a cause, and that cause had to be God. And then we went from that period to the rise of materialism and atheism. So this book covered a lot. So it's wordy, but gems are inside of it nonetheless. With that being stated, we're going to close out the show, and I will pick up where we left off at a later date. We're going to end the show with my brother, LV Europa. Always showing love. Yeah, I try, man. I know it's wordy, man. It's wordy, but bear with me. Shalom to you, REA. Shalom. Let me pull up my brother LV on YouTube. Y'all can subscribe to his channel, LV Europa TV. And get in tune with his music, man. Powerful brother, very talented brother. Let's go. Y'all gonna see him on your screen here now. Stay tuned. I will be completing this book in its entirety. You know how we do. We actually read books over here. Let's get it.
King Los, thanks for the reputation. Now I spit rap advice to my divination. Paintbrushes, strokes to the canvas made of hopes. They know God touched these notes. Wake up to my demonstration. Whatever's intended, no limit, I did it for need. Manuscript wrote by lip and I couldn't even read. This also hereditary, keep it in your gene pool. I still got gene grade in my gene pool. For the record, I wreck rooms for recreation. Recognize real rap really revolves reputation. Did deals with dudes on dailies, you pick a destination. Instead of a course that's pre-designated. The news said the black man is target. So I rallied on my niggas, pull them bands off the market. Invested in your spirit so you make it on the guard list. We buried in troubles, you just making sure it's guarded. Fruits of the label, we just planted in the garden. No Julius Caesar salad in my apartment. My light built for real at will, we started sparking. My bright fuse are free and will. You charging? Go ahead, mention how I do it like me. Everybody else killed for free. Rope of the house I built, go and give me my deed. Put my ashes in the ground, let it soak into a tree. Take the syrup from the branches, start rolling in the street. Get the kids on the set, let the hoes roll a leaf. And for my niggas, you get your own shit. Free your damn mind, start jumping off your own dick. Roper. I got more, plenty in store. Half price for all my memoirs. Memory set in stone. That's a ravel off my bone. I take matters in my own. While yours acts in a graveyard. I don't hang around, you catch a news later. New as paper. For all my niggas who moving major. 3-piece Taylor. White bitch from Baylor. Busting open the rum. Guzzling with the sailors. I hit the It's Roper. Come on, man. Fucking God voice, man. Rope the people. Stop playing dumb, man. The energy is here. King Los, holla at me. I want to interview you. You Roper Report TV. Tell that nigga to Sue Surf to holla at me, nigga.
All right, man. I hope y'all got something from this. I hope it was meaningful. We will be continuing the book, and I'm going to finish this book live. We read books over here. You know how we rocking, man. 7 gang, Source gang over everything. Gang!